A woman steps off a train into hell, armed with nothing but a leather ledger and a wedding dress she'll never wear. The man waiting isn't her salvation. He's her ruin. His ranch is dying. His debts are crushing. Foreclosure is 3 weeks away. Any sane person would run. She asks to see his books instead. This is the story of how intelligence became the deadliest weapon on the frontier, and how two strangers turned certain death into an empire. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop with a metal groan that seemed to echo across the entire Nebraska prairie. Evelyn Carter pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching dust swirl in golden clouds across a landscape so flat and empty it made her chest tighten. She'd spent 3 days crossing from Philadelphia, each mile taking her further from everything civilized, everything she understood. Now, as the conductor called out Ashford Station, in a voice that suggested the town barely deserved the name, she felt the full weight of what she'd done. She was a mail-order bride. 3 months ago, those words would have been unthinkable. Evelyn gathered her skirts, deep green silk that already seemed absurdly ornate for this place, and made her way down the narrow aisle. Her trunk would follow. Everything she owned in the world was in that trunk. Books, her mother's silver, 3 dresses, and the ledgers from her father's business. Those ledgers were probably worth more to her than the silver. The platform was nothing more than weathered planks and a lean-to that called itself a station house. The sun hammered down with aggressive intensity, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass and something else. Desperation, maybe, though Evelyn knew that was just her imagination painting the scene darker than it needed to be. Then she saw him. Caleb Boone stood at the far end of the platform, hat in his hands, looking like a man attending a funeral. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that seemed carved from the same stone as the distant hills. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped Evelyn's breath. It was the expression on his face. He looked defeated. This was the man whose letters had been so full of hope, describing a ranch with potential, a future worth building. This was the man who'd written about clear streams and fertile valleys, about cattle and opportunity. The man before her looked like he'd already lost everything and was just waiting for the earth to finish swallowing him whole. Their eyes met across 30 feet of sun-bleached wood. For a moment, neither moved. Then Caleb walked forward, his boots heavy on the planks, and Evelyn understood something with perfect clarity. Whatever she'd imagined about her new life was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. "Miss Carter?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. "I'm Caleb Boone." "Mr. Boone." She extended her hand and he stared at it for a moment before remembering to shake it. His palm was calloused, his grip careful, like he was afraid of breaking her. "Your trunk." "We'll be fine for a moment." Evelyn withdrew her hand and studied his face. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into every line, the way his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "You look like you're about to tell me something I won't want to hear." Caleb's eyes widened slightly. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're observant. It's a necessity in my line of work." She caught herself. "My former line of work." "What was that?" "I kept my father's books, managed his accounts, ran his office after my mother died." The words came out clipped, defensive. She wasn't ashamed of it, but she knew how men reacted to women who understood numbers better than needlework. Caleb just nodded slowly. "Then you'll understand what I'm about to say better than most." He took a breath that seemed to hurt. "Miss Carter, I need to be honest with you before we go any further. My ranch—" He stopped, his throat working. "It's dying. I'm 3 weeks from foreclosure, maybe less. I've got debts I can't pay, cattle I can't afford to feed, and land that's not producing enough to keep body and soul together." He looked her straight in the eye. "I brought you out here under false pretenses. Everything I wrote in those letters was true 6 months ago. Now it's all falling apart, and I don't have the right to hold you to any promise you made." The prairie wind picked up, tugging at Evelyn's hat. Around them, the handful of other passengers were being collected by family or heading toward the town's single street. No one paid them any attention. "Are you telling me you want me to leave?" Evelyn asked. "I'm telling you that you should leave. Any reasonable person would. I can't offer you the life I promised. Hell, I can't offer you much of anything except hard work and likely failure." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the same methodical approach she'd used for her father's accounts. The situation was worse than she'd feared, but the honesty was unexpected. Most men would have hidden the truth until after the wedding, trapped her into a bad situation. 3 weeks until foreclosure, she said finally. Give or take. How much do you owe? Caleb blinked. That's not... How much? $2,000. Might as well be $2 million. Evelyn did the calculation automatically. With interest, with penalties. She nodded. And the land itself? How many acres? Miss Carter, I don't think... How many acres, Mr. Boone? He stared at her like she'd started speaking another language. 320, but most of it's rough country, not good for much. Water rights? Some. Creek runs through the property, feeds into the Platte. Livestock? Down to 40 head of cattle, most of them too lean to sell at decent price. A few horses. Infrastructure? What? Buildings, fences, equipment. Caleb's expression had shifted from defeated to confused. There's the main house, needs work, a barn that's sound, some outbuildings, fencing's in poor shape. Evelyn picked up her small travel bag and started walking toward the edge of the platform. Caleb hurried to follow. Miss Carter, did you hear what I said about the foreclosure? I heard you. And you're not getting back on that train? She stopped and turned to face him. The sun was behind her now, putting her face in shadow, and she realized she was using every bit of composure her mother had taught her to keep her voice steady. Because the truth was, her heart was hammering like a drum. She had $23 in her purse, no family to return to, no prospects back east, and this stranger was offering her an out, a chance to walk away from what was clearly a disaster. But $23 wouldn't last long. And the disaster, well, disasters could sometimes be managed, if you were smart about it. Mr. Boone, she said carefully, I assume you have books, records of your finances, your inventory, your transactions. Such as they are, but I'd like to see them. The confusion on his face deepened into something almost comical. You want to see my books? Yes. Why? Because you're telling me we're facing a crisis, and I don't know how to evaluate a crisis without seeing the numbers. She adjusted her bag on her arm. Now, is your wagon nearby, or do we need to arrange transport? Caleb just stared at her. Then, slowly, he put his hat back on and gestured toward a weathered wagon hitched to 2 horses that looked only marginally more optimistic than their owner. This way, he said. The ride to the ranch took an hour, following a rutted track that called itself a road. Evelyn sat rigid on the wagon seat, partly because the jolting would have thrown her off otherwise, and partly because she was acutely aware of Caleb beside her. He drove in silence, and she didn't push conversation. She was too busy absorbing the landscape. It was harsher than she'd imagined. Beautiful in a stark way, but harsh. The grass stretched endlessly, broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings or distant tree lines that marked creek beds. The sky was enormous, unmarked by anything except a few wisps of cloud. She saw no other houses, no signs of civilization except the track they followed. This was the frontier. Real frontier, not the romantic version from dime novels. That's the north boundary, Caleb said suddenly, pointing to a line of fence posts barely visible in the distance. Property runs from that ridge to the creek bed, then east to the county road. Evelyn nodded, filing the information away. Not much to look at, he continued, his voice rough. Grass is already going brown. Should have another month of green, but we haven't had rain in 6 weeks. What about irrigation? Creek's too far down to pump from, and I can't afford equipment anyway. He flicked the reins, urging the horses around a particularly deep rut. Had plans for that once, had plans for a lot of things. There was such profound weariness in his voice that Evelyn felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. This man had been fighting alone, watching everything he'd built crumble, and now he was confessing his failures to a stranger he'd promised a future to. Plans can be adjusted, she said. He glanced at her. You're an optimist. I'm a realist. There's a difference. She gripped the wagon seat as they lurched over a stone. Optimists believe things will work out. Realists evaluate whether they can be made to work out. And you think this can be made to work out. I think I need to see your books. A smile ghosted across his face, the first she'd seen from him. You really do keep coming back to that. Numbers don't lie, Mr. Boone. People do. Plans do. Hope does. But numbers tell you exactly where you stand. Where we stand is on the edge of a cliff. Then we'll see how far the fall is. The ranch appeared over a low rise, and Evelyn's first impression was of profound neglect. The house was a two-story structure with a sagging porch and windows that looked like they hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The barn was in better shape, but needed paint. Several outbuildings were in various states of disrepair, and the fencing she could see was indeed poor, post leaning, wire sagging. But the land itself, the land had potential. The creek Caleb had mentioned wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods. There was a natural meadow that would be good for hay. The hills provided windbreak. She could see it, if she squinted, see what this place could be with proper management and investment. Investment they didn't have. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Home, he said, the word heavy with irony. Evelyn climbed down before he could offer assistance, her legs grateful for solid ground after the rough ride. A dog emerged from the barn, some kind of cattle dog mix, and approached cautiously. She extended her hand, and after a moment of consideration, the dog allowed her to scratch behind its ears. That's Rufus, Caleb said, retrieving her trunk from the wagon. Only reliable male on the property. Is there anyone else here? Had a hand until last month. Couldn't afford to pay him anymore. He carried the trunk toward the house. It's been just me since then. Evelyn followed him inside, and the interior confirmed her assessment. Neglect born of exhaustion, not laziness. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace and good bones, but dust covered everything, and there were dishes in the sink that looked several days old. A staircase led to the second floor. You can have the main bedroom upstairs, Caleb said, setting her trunk down. I've been sleeping in the back room. There's a pump in the kitchen for water, and the outhouse is... Mr. Boone. Evelyn removed her hat and gloves, setting them precisely on a side table. The books. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to a desk in the corner, pulled open a drawer, and extracted a battered ledger and a sheaf of papers. He brought them to the table, cleared away the dishes with his arm, and set them down. It's all there, he said. Every mistake I've made for the past 2 years. Evelyn pulled out a chair and sat down. She opened the ledger, and her trained eye immediately began parsing the entries. Caleb's handwriting was rough but legible. The accounts were, well, they were a disaster, but they were honest. She read in silence for several minutes, occasionally making notes on a scrap of paper. Caleb stood near the fireplace, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Finally, she looked up. Your primary creditor is the Bank of Ashford. Yes. Run by a man named... She checked the papers. Silas Merchant. That's him. Original loan was for $1,000. You've paid back $700 over 2 years, but with penalties and interest, you now owe $2,000. Sounds about right. Evelyn tapped her pencil against the table. That's predatory lending. It's frontier banking. It's theft dressed in legal language. She turned a page. You took the loan to expand your herd and improve infrastructure. Yes. But you suffered losses due to drought the first year, and cattle prices collapsed the second year. Yes. And Merchant refused to restructure the loan. Caleb laughed bitterly. Merchant doesn't restructure. He forecloses. That's how he's accumulated half the farmland in the county. Evelyn made another note. She went through the papers systematically, building a picture of the ranch's finances. It took nearly an hour, and Caleb never interrupted, just stood there watching her work like she was performing some kind of mysterious ritual. When she finally closed the ledger, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the room in amber light. All right, she said. All right, what? I've seen enough. Caleb crossed to the table, his movements tense. And your conclusion is that you should get on tomorrow's train back to civilization. My conclusion, Evelyn said carefully, is that you're not failing because you're lazy or incompetent. You're failing because you've been fighting the wrong battle. He stared at her. What? You've been trying to outproduce your debt. More cattle, more work, more output. But the mathematics don't support that strategy. Even if you had perfect conditions, the timeline doesn't work. You can't earn your way out of this hole before foreclosure hits. I know that, Caleb said, his voice rough. That's why I told you to leave. But there are other approaches. Evelyn stood, walking to the window. The view was better than the house, rolling prairie touched with gold in the dying light. You have assets here that you're not leveraging. You have land, water rights, and infrastructure. Those have value beyond cattle production. Not enough value to pay off merchant. Perhaps not directly. She turned to face him. But enough to change the terms of the game. Caleb's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been hope, though he was clearly trying to suppress it. I don't understand. Mr. Boone, I spent 5 years managing my father's business during some very difficult times. I learned that financial problems are rarely solved by working harder at the same failing strategy. They're solved by changing the strategy itself. What? She moved back to the table, resting her hand on the ledger. You need to diversify your income, leverage your assets more effectively, and buy yourself time to implement sustainable changes. That sounds good in theory, but in practice, it means we need to do several things simultaneously. First, we need to identify immediate sources of cash to slow the foreclosure timeline. Second, we need to restructure your debt in a way that gives us breathing room. Third, we need to pivot your operations toward more profitable uses of your resources. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Miss Carter, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you're talking about things that require capital I don't have, time I don't have, and expertise I definitely don't have. You have me, Evelyn said simply. The words hung in the air between them. Why? Caleb asked finally. Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You could leave tomorrow with a clear conscience. Evelyn sat down across from him. It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Because I have nowhere else to go, she said quietly. My father died 3 months ago. His business partner seized everything, legally, though not ethically. I had 3 options. Find work in a city where no one hires female bookkeepers, impose on distant relatives who made it clear I wasn't welcome, or respond to an advertisement for a mail-order bride. She met his eyes. I chose the latter because at least it offered the possibility of building something new, something mine. And now you find out that something is falling apart. Yes, but falling apart means it still exists. There's still something here to save. She gestured to the window, the land beyond. I could go back east and spend my life as a dependent, managing other people's affairs for room and board. Or I could stay here and see if we can turn this disaster into something sustainable, maybe even something successful. We, Caleb repeated. We, Evelyn confirmed. If you're willing to try things my way, which will seem strange and possibly wrong to you because you're used to the frontier approach of physical labor and perseverance, I'm offering you a different approach, strategic thinking and financial manipulation. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You understand that if we fail, you'll have nothing, less than nothing. I understand that if I leave, I'll definitely have nothing. Evelyn stood and extended her hand across the table. So, do we have a partnership, Mr. Boone? He looked at her hand, then at her face, and she could see him wrestling with something, pride maybe, or fear, or just exhaustion. Then, slowly he stood and took her hand. Partnership, he said, though I'm probably going to regret this. Statistically possible, Evelyn agreed, but less likely than you think. His grip was firm, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something other than defeat in his eyes. It wasn't quite hope yet, but it was curiosity, and on the frontier she was learning, that was enough to start with. They spent the next 3 days in a pattern that would have seemed insane to any observer. While Caleb handled the physical demands of the ranch, feeding livestock, repairing fence, hauling water, Evelyn turned the main room into a war room. She spread papers across every surface, organized the ledgers chronologically, and began building a comprehensive picture of the ranch's financial situation. But more than that, she started creating what she called scenario maps, charts showing different potential paths forward and their probable outcomes. Caleb would come in for meals to find her surrounded by papers, muttering calculations, and he'd learn to simply set food near her and wait for her to surface from whatever financial puzzle she was solving. On the 3rd evening, as dusk painted the windows orange, she finally looked up from her work. I need to see the property, she said. Caleb, who'd been oiling a harness at the kitchen table, looked over. "You've been here 3 days and haven't looked around?" "I've been analyzing the theoretical. Now I need to see the practical." She stood, stretching muscles that had been still too long. "Tomorrow morning, I need you to show me everything. Everything's a lot of ground to cover." "Then we should start early." The next morning, just after dawn, they set out on horseback. Caleb had assumed Evelyn couldn't ride, but she'd surprised him by mounting with practiced efficiency. "My father believed in practical education," she'd explained, settling into the saddle. "Even for daughters." They rode the property boundaries first, and Evelyn took notes in a small book she'd brought. She asked questions constantly about soil quality, water access, wildlife, weather patterns, neighboring properties. Caleb answered as best he could, though her questions often veered in directions he didn't expect. "That stand of timber along the creek," she said, pointing. "How much of it is on your land?" "Maybe 2 acres worth." "Has it ever been harvested?" "No, didn't seem worth the effort." She made a note. "And the creek itself?" "You said it feeds into the Platte." "Eventually, yeah, runs east across several properties first." "Including Aaron Blackwell's land?" Caleb's jaw tightened at the name. "Yes." "Tell me about Blackwell." "What do you want to know?" "Why you got tense when I mentioned his name?" Caleb was quiet for a moment as they rode. Then he said, "Aaron Blackwell owns the Triple Bar Ranch, biggest operation in the county. 5,000 acres, hundreds of head of cattle. He's been buying up failing ranches for years, expanding his territory. Including yours, potentially. He's made offers, lowball offers meant to insult. He figures when I go under, he'll pick up the land for taxes." Evelyn nodded, filing this information away. "Does he use the creek?" "His cattle water from it downstream. Why?" "Because water rights are valuable, Mr. Boone, especially in drought conditions. And if your property controls access to a water source he needs, that's leverage." They rode on, and Evelyn continued her systematic inventory. She examined the apple trees planted near the house. "These are mature trees, good producers. How much fruit do they yield? And the hay meadow. This should be cut twice a season, properly managed. And the rough country up in the hills. Not good for cattle, but possibly for sheep or goats." By midday, they'd covered most of the property, and Caleb had started to see it through her eyes. Not as a cattle ranch, but as a collection of assets, each with potential value if properly developed. They stopped to rest the horses near the creek, in the shade of the cottonwoods. Evelyn pulled out her notebook and began sketching something while Caleb unpacked the lunch he'd brought. "You're making a map," he observed. "Resource map," she corrected, "showing what assets we have and how they might connect to create value streams." Value streams. Income sources. She accepted the canteen he offered. "The mistake you've been making is thinking of this as a cattle ranch. It's not. It's a piece of land with multiple potential uses, only one of which is cattle ranching. That's what frontier land is for, ranching or farming." "That's conventional thinking. Conventional thinking is why you're in debt." She took a drink, then continued, "I've identified at least 7 potential revenue sources on this property that you're currently not utilizing." Caleb sat down on a fallen log. "All right, I'll bite. What are they?" Evelyn consulted her notes. 1. The apple trees. You have 40 mature trees producing fruit you don't harvest. We can dry apples for winter trade, make cider, or sell fresh fruit to supply stores in town. The amount of apples from 40 trees will generate approximately $60 to $80 if properly processed and sold. Not a fortune, but enough to matter. 2. The timber along the creek. 2 acres of mature hardwood has value for fence posts, building materials, or firewood. Selective cutting could generate another $100 without destroying the resource. I don't have time to run a lumber operation. You don't have to. You sell the rights to a logging crew for a percentage. 3. Water rights. Your creek provides water to downstream properties. You could negotiate fees for that access, especially during drought. Blackwell would never pay for water he's used for free. Blackwell will pay for whatever a contract says he must pay for. We'll get to that. 4. Hay meadow. You're cutting hay for your own cattle, but you're not selling surplus. There's always demand for hay, especially in dry years. Caleb was starting to lean forward now, engaged despite himself. All right, what else? 5. Adjustment services. What? Boarding other people's livestock for a fee. You have grazing land you're not fully utilizing. Other ranchers might pay to pasture cattle here during parts of the year. No one's going to pay me to watch their cattle. They will if you offer better rates than driving them to distant pastures, and if you include other services, branding, basic veterinary care. 6. Equipment rental. You have a wagon, farm implements, tools. These could be rented to smaller homesteaders who can't afford to buy their own. Miss Carter. And 7, she continued, you have 320 acres of land. Some of it could be leased for specific purposes, hunting rights, beekeeping, whatever the market demands. Caleb stared at her. You're talking about turning a cattle ranch into, what, some kind of general frontier supply operation? I'm talking about maximizing the return on your assets. Cattle ranching is one income stream, a risky, capital-intensive, low-margin income stream. Diversifying reduces risk and increases overall profitability. This is insane. This is economics. Evelyn closed her notebook. Mr. Boone, you've been thinking like a rancher. You need to start thinking like a businessman. I am a rancher. Right now, you're a rancher about to lose his ranch. If you want to stay a rancher, you need to first become a businessman who owns a ranch. There's a difference. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the creek burble past. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals. Finally, Caleb said, even if I agreed with all of this, and I'm not saying I do, we don't have time. We have less than 3 weeks. We have time for phase 1. Apple harvest and processing starts immediately. That's fast cash. Timber rights can be negotiated within days. Hay can be cut and sold before foreclosure. She met his eyes. But you're right that we can't implement everything simultaneously, which is why the real priority isn't income generation. It's not? No. The real priority is buying ourselves more time, which means dealing with Silas Merchant and that predatory loan. Caleb's expression darkened. Merchant doesn't negotiate. I've tried. You've tried as a desperate rancher asking for mercy. That's not negotiation, that's begging. Evelyn stood, brushing off her skirt. When I negotiate with Merchant, it will be from a position of strategy. What strategy? We just established we're broke. We're cash poor but asset rich. There's a difference, and I'm beginning to have an idea about how to use that difference. She walked to her horse, then turned back. But first, I need to understand the local power structure better. Tell me about the town. Who matters? Who has influence? And most importantly, who owes whom what? They rode back to the ranch, and Caleb talked. He told her about Ashford, a frontier town of maybe 200 permanent residents, plus the transient population of cowboys, traders, and travelers. He described the key figures: Silas Merchant, the banker, Aaron Blackwell, the big rancher, Judge Thomas Cooper, who handled most legal matters, the merchants and saloon owners, and the minister. Evelyn listened intently, building a mental map of relationships and leverage points. By the time they returned to the ranch, she had a clearer picture of what they were working with. That evening, as Caleb worked on repairs outside, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a fresh sheet of paper. At the top she wrote, Strategic Plan, Phase 1. Below that, she began outlining specific actions with timelines and expected outcomes. It was something she'd done 100 times for her father's business, but never with stakes this high. Every decision mattered. Every miscalculation could mean disaster. She was 3 hours into the work when Caleb came back inside, dusty and tired. He washed up at the pump, then looked over her shoulder at what she'd written. That's a lot of words, he said. It's a plan. Looks more like a novel. Plans need details. Vagueness is the enemy of execution. She set down her pen. I'll need your cooperation on several fronts. Some of them will seem strange. Everything about this seems strange. Fair enough. She turned to face him. First thing tomorrow, we start harvesting apples. All of them. We'll need crates, a drying setup, and access to the root cellar for storage. I can manage that. Second, I need you to send word to any logging crews working in the area. Tell them you're open to discussing timber rights. There's a crew working Blackwell's land north of here. They'll be around for another few weeks. Perfect. Third, and this is important, I need you to not mention any of this to anyone else. Not the bank, Not your neighbors, not the people in town. Caleb frowned. Why the secrecy? Because information is currency, Mr. Boone. Right now, everyone thinks you're failing predictably. That gives us an advantage. If we telegraph our strategy, people will adapt and counter. We need to move faster than the opposition can respond. The opposition being Merchant, and possibly Blackwell, depending on how this plays out. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening prairie. Men with power resist change that threatens that power. We're about to change a lot of things very quickly. Some people won't like it. Caleb came to stand beside her. You're talking about making enemies. I'm talking about survival. If making enemies is the cost, then that's what we pay. She glanced at him. Are you willing to pay it? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're not what I expected. No one ever is. But that's not an answer to my question. Caleb looked out at his land, at the ranch he'd built with his own hands and was about to lose. My father homesteaded this property 30 years ago, died defending it from claim jumpers when I was 15. I've spent 20 years working this land, building it up, trying to make it something worth passing on. His jaw clenched. I'm not letting Merchant take it without a fight. So yeah, I'm willing to make enemies if that's what it takes. Evelyn nodded. Good, because things are about to get very complicated. She didn't know how right she was. The next week became a blur of relentless activity. At dawn, they began harvesting apples, and Evelyn demonstrated a talent for systematic efficiency that impressed even Caleb. She'd devised a method for sorting the fruit, best quality for immediate sale, good quality for drying, bruised fruit for cider, and she worked with the same focused intensity she brought to bookkeeping. Caleb handled the physical labor, but Evelyn managed the process, keeping track of quantities and calculating potential returns. By the end of the third day, they'd harvested every tree and had apples sorted in the root cellar. This is more fruit than I've ever dealt with in my life, Caleb admitted. This is more fruit than you've ever monetized in your life, Evelyn corrected. There's a difference. Tomorrow, you'll take the premium apples to town and negotiate a supply contract with the general store. I've prepared the pricing structure. She handed him a paper. Don't accept less than these amounts. Mrs. Fletcher at the general store will think I've lost my mind. Mrs. Fletcher will think you've found business sense. There's a difference. The timber negotiations went faster than expected. The logging crew Caleb contacted came out to survey the property, and Evelyn handled the discussion with the same cool professionalism she'd used on everything else. She negotiated a contract that gave them a percentage of the timber value, plus guarantees about replanting and land restoration. The crew boss, a grizzled man named Jackson, seemed amused by the whole thing. Never negotiated with a woman before, he told Caleb later. She drives a harder bargain than most men. Yeah, Caleb said, watching Evelyn review the contract one final time. I'm learning that. But it was the water rights issue that proved most complicated. Evelyn had researched territorial water law in her father's law books and discovered something interesting. Traditional water rights were based on prior appropriation. First use established priority. But newer territorial codes were shifting toward beneficial use standards, which meant rights could be challenged if water wasn't being fully utilized or if downstream users were being harmed. Blackwell's been using your water for free because no one challenged it, she explained to Caleb. But you have legal standing to establish formal water rights and charge for access. That'll start a war, Caleb said. It'll start a negotiation. There's a difference. The confrontation came faster than either expected. On the seventh day, as Caleb was working on fence repairs along the northern boundary, 3 riders approached from the Triple Bar Ranch. The lead rider was Aaron Blackwell himself, a man in his 50s with silver in his beard and eyes like chips of flint. Caleb straightened from his work as they approached. Boone, Blackwell said, not bothering with pleasantries. Blackwell, heard you've been making noise about water rights. Not noise, legal inquiries. Same thing. Blackwell leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a growl. That creek's been open access for 20 years. No one charges for it. Maybe someone should start. You're 3 weeks from foreclosure, Boone. You really want to spend your last days making enemies? I'm spending my last days trying to stay solvent. If that makes enemies, so be it. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. This doesn't sound like you. Sounds like that East Coast woman I heard came in on the train last week. She putting ideas in your head? She's putting facts in my head. Water law says, I don't give a damn what water law says. Blackwell cut him off. I'm telling you how things work on this frontier. You don't charge neighbors for water. It's not done. It's done when the water has value, and the man who owns it has bills to pay. The two men stared at each other, and Caleb felt the weight of the moment. This was a line being crossed, a challenge to the old ways of doing things. Blackwell represented the established order, the big ranchers who made the rules, and Caleb was breaking those rules. You're making a mistake, Blackwell said finally. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Blackwell straightened in his saddle, and his voice went cold. Merchant's going to foreclose on you in 2 weeks. Everyone knows it. When that happens, I'll buy this land for taxes, and then we'll see who controls the water. He wheeled his horse around. Enjoy your last days, Boone. They rode off, and Caleb stood watching them go, his heart pounding. He'd just burned a bridge he couldn't rebuild. When he returned to the ranch that evening, Evelyn was in the kitchen, working through more calculations. He told her about the confrontation. She listened without interrupting, then nodded. Good. Good? I just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county. You established that we're serious about defending our rights. That's different. She made a note on her paper. Blackwell's predictable. He's used to intimidating people into submission. When you didn't submit, he fell back on threats. But threats only work if he can follow through. He's planning to buy the land after foreclosure. Then we need to make sure there's no foreclosure. She looked up at him. Which brings us to the next phase. I need to go to town tomorrow. I need to see Merchant. That's a bad idea. It's a necessary idea. Merchant will eat you alive. Merchant will underestimate me. There's a difference. She stood gathering her papers. I've been analyzing his loan patterns across other foreclosures. He has a method, a system, and every system has weaknesses. What weakness? Greed. Merchant is so focused on acquiring property that he's over-leveraged. He's carrying significant debt himself, borrowed against future foreclosures. If I can prove that our ranch is worth more saved than foreclosed, I can shift his incentive structure. Caleb shook his head. You're talking about negotiating with a predator. I'm talking about manipulating a businessman. Predators are emotional. Businessmen respond to profit. She met his eyes. Trust me, Mr. Boone. This is what I do. The next morning, Evelyn dressed carefully for town. Her best dress, her mother's cameo, gloves, and hat. She looked every inch the refined Eastern lady, and Caleb understood it was armor of a sort. They rode into Ashford together, drawing stares from the townspeople. The mail-order bride who hadn't run away was already a curiosity. The mail-order bride heading to the bank was scandal. The Bank of Ashford was a 2-story brick building, by far the most substantial structure in town. Evelyn walked in like she owned it, Caleb trailing behind, feeling distinctly out of place. Silas Merchant looked up from his desk as they entered. He was a thin man in his 40s, impeccably dressed, with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. Mr. Boone, he said, his voice smooth, and this must be Miss Carter. I heard you'd arrived. Mrs. Boone, actually, Evelyn said calmly. We were married yesterday by Judge Cooper. Caleb blinked. They absolutely had not been married yesterday. But Evelyn's expression was serene, and he understood. This was strategy. Merchant's smile widened slightly. Congratulations. Though I'm afraid marriage doesn't change your husband's financial situation. On the contrary, Mr. Merchant, marriage creates a legal partnership, which means I now have standing to negotiate on behalf of our shared interests. She pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for invitation. I'd like to discuss the terms of our loan. The loan is quite simple, Mrs. Boone. Payment in full is due in 13 days. If payment isn't received, we foreclose. I've reviewed the loan documents. I believe the interest calculations are incorrect. Merchant's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. I assure you, everything is in order. Your original loan was $1,000 at 12% annual interest. Over 2 years, with my husband's payments, the balance should be approximately $500. Instead, you claim $2,000 is owed. There were penalties for late payments, fees for extensions, compounding. Compounding that violates territorial lending statutes. Evelyn pulled out a paper. I've documented every transaction. Your calculations include charges that aren't legally enforceable. Merchant stood, his hands flat on the desk. Mrs. Boone, I don't know how things work back east, but here we have our own way of conducting business. Business conducted in violation of territorial law is fraud, Mr. Merchant, not local custom. She remained seated, calm. I'm prepared to file a complaint with the Territorial Banking Commission. That would take months to resolve. You'll be foreclosed long before, unless Judge Cooper issues a temporary injunction pending review, which he will, given the documented violations. She smiled slightly. I met with him this morning, before coming here. It was a lie, Caleb knew, but it was a convincing lie, delivered with perfect confidence. Merchant sat back down slowly. What do you want? A restructured loan, $900, the legitimate amount owed, paid over 18 months at 6% interest. No penalties, no additional fees. That's ridiculous. That's generous, considering I could make a case for you owing us a refund of overpayments. She leaned forward. Mr. Merchant, you're a businessman. This ranch is worth more to you performing than foreclosed. If you restructure reasonably, you get your money plus legitimate interest. If you foreclose, you get property in a depressed market that you'll struggle to sell, plus legal complications from my complaint. She let that sink in. One path gives you guaranteed return. The other gives you risk and trouble. Merchant's jaw was tight. You're bluffing about the banking commission. Try me. They stared at each other across the desk. Caleb held his breath, waiting for Merchant to explode, to throw them out, to call her bluff. Instead, Merchant said, 18 months is too long. 12 months. 15 months. 12 months, 7% interest. 15 months, 6%. Another long silence. Then Merchant said, I want collateral. Beyond the property. What kind of collateral? Water rights. Formal documentation that if you default, I control water access across the property. Evelyn considered this. Agreed, but in exchange you acknowledge the original loan violations in writing. That's non-negotiable. You get additional collateral. I get documentation that protects us legally. Merchant looked like he'd swallowed something bitter, but finally he nodded. I'll have papers drawn up. I'll review them before signing. We'll return tomorrow. Evelyn stood, and Caleb scrambled to follow. Good day, Mr. Merchant. They walked out of the bank into the afternoon sunlight, and Caleb felt like he'd just witnessed something impossible. Did that just happen? He asked. Yes. Did we just buy ourselves 15 months? Yes. How? Evelyn smiled, a real smile this time, not strategic armor. I told you, numbers don't lie. Merchant's entire operation relies on appearing more powerful than he is. I called that bluff with a bigger bluff, backed by just enough truth to make him uncertain. The banking commission complaint? Oh, I absolutely intend to file that. It'll take months to resolve, but it'll create enough trouble to make foreclosure messy. Merchant knows that, so he'll take the safe path. She looked back at the bank. We just turned certain failure into manageable challenge. And the marriage? A convenient fiction to give me legal standing. We'll make it real eventually, I assume, given the circumstances. But for now, let's just let people believe what's useful for them to believe. Caleb stopped walking. You lied to a banker and bluffed your way into restructuring a predatory loan. Yes, that's... He paused, searching for words. That's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Business is often terrifying, Mr. Boone. You just don't usually see it up close. She started walking again. Now, come on, we have work to do. 15 months sounds like a lot, but it's really not. We need to make this ranch profitable, and we need to do it faster than seems possible. They rode back to the ranch in silence, and Caleb found himself reassessing everything he'd thought he understood about survival on the frontier. He'd always believed it was about strength, endurance, and hard work. Evelyn was teaching him it was about strategy, information, and the courage to challenge systems everyone else accepted as unchangeable. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table reviewing the next steps of the plan, Caleb said, "Thank you." Evelyn looked up from her papers. For what? For not leaving. For caring about this place. For... He gestured at the papers, the plans, everything she'd built in just over a week. For seeing what I couldn't see. I haven't saved anything yet, Mr. Boone. We've just bought ourselves a fighting chance. Still, thank you. She nodded, and for a moment something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. They were partners in something that mattered, facing impossible odds with nothing but intelligence and determination. We should get some sleep, Evelyn said finally. Tomorrow we need to start implementing Phase 2. What's Phase 2? Everything else. She smiled slightly. Told you it would get complicated. As Caleb lay in his bed that night, listening to the prairie wind whistle around the house, he realized something had shifted. A week ago, he'd been a man waiting to lose everything, going through motions without hope. Now he was a man with a plan, a partner, and a chance. It was a slim chance. The obstacles were enormous. Merchant would be looking for revenge. Blackwell would be watching for weakness. The land itself remained harsh and unforgiving. But for the first time in months, Caleb Boone believed they might actually survive this. And in the room above, Evelyn Carter lay awake, running calculations in her mind, already 3 steps ahead, planning for contingencies and opportunities that hadn't emerged yet. Neither of them could sleep much. There was too much to do, too much riding on their success. But both of them, in their own ways, felt something they hadn't felt in a long time, hope backed by strategy. And on the frontier, that combination was more dangerous than any amount of muscle or gunpowder. The restructured loan papers arrived 3 days later, delivered by a sullen bank clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Evelyn spent 2 hours reviewing every line, every clause, making notes in the margins while Caleb paced the kitchen like a caged animal. Well? He asked for the 4th time. Patience, Mr. Boone. I've been patient for 2 hours. Then another 10 minutes won't kill you. She turned a page, her eyes scanning the dense legal language. Merchant had tried to slip in additional provisions. A clause about inspection rights. Another about accelerated payment if certain conditions weren't met. She crossed them out with firm strokes of her pen. Finally, she set down the papers and looked up. It's acceptable. Barely. He's tried to insert some poison pills, but nothing we can't negotiate out. So we sign? So I take these back to town tomorrow and make him remove the problematic sections. Then we sign. She stood, stretching her back. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, we need to discuss something more immediate. What's that? The fact that we just told the entire town we're married, but we're not actually married. She met his eyes directly. That's going to create complications if we don't address it. Caleb felt heat rise in his face. In all the chaos of negotiating with Merchant, he'd somehow pushed that particular lie to the back of his mind. I suppose we should... we could make it real, Evelyn finished for him. It would be practical. Legal protections, simplified decision-making, and it would eliminate questions about propriety. That's a hell of a romantic proposal. Romance isn't the goal here, Mr. Boone. Survival is. But her expression softened slightly. Though I suppose if we're going to be partners in saving this ranch, we might as well be legal partners too. It would make things simpler. Caleb studied her face, trying to read what she was thinking. This woman had appeared in his life barely 2 weeks ago, and she'd already turned everything upside down. She was brilliant, fearless, and completely unlike anyone he'd ever known. Marriage to her would be... He didn't even know what it would be. All right, he said finally. If you're willing, I'm willing. Good. Judge Cooper can handle it when I'm in town tomorrow. She said it like she was scheduling a business appointment, but Caleb caught something in her voice, nervousness maybe, or uncertainty. She wasn't as composed as she pretended. Evelyn, he said, using her first name for the first time. Are you sure about this? About any of this? She was quiet for a long moment. No, she admitted. I'm not sure about anything. But certainty is a luxury people like us can't afford. So I'm choosing the path that seems most likely to lead somewhere worth going. She managed a small smile. That's the best I can offer. It's enough, Caleb said, and meant it. The next morning, Evelyn rode into town alone, carrying the marked-up loan papers and wearing her determination like armor. The bank negotiation took 3 tense hours, with Merchant arguing against every change she'd made. But in the end, he signed the revised version. They both knew she'd backed him into a corner he couldn't escape from. Judge Cooper performed the marriage ceremony in his office with his clerk as witness. It took 5 minutes, and Evelyn felt a strange sense of unreality as she signed her new name, Evelyn Boone, in the register. She'd come west expecting this, had answered the advertisement knowing marriage was the purpose, but somehow the reality felt more weighty than she'd anticipated. "Mrs. Boone," Judge Cooper said, shaking her hand, "congratulations. You've certainly made an impression on our town in a short time. I hope it's not too much of a scandal, Your Honor." "Scandal?" Cooper chuckled. "My dear, you've given the ladies of Ashford enough gossip to last through winter. The Eastern bride who took on Silas Merchant and won? You're practically legendary already." "I didn't win. I negotiated." "Out here, that amounts to the same thing." He handed her the marriage certificate. "Take care of that husband of yours. And that ranch. I'd like to see you succeed." "Thank you, Your Honor. I intend to." She rode back to the ranch with 2 documents in her saddlebag that would determine their future: a marriage certificate and a restructured loan. Both were gambles. Both could still fail. But they represented possibility, and that was more than they'd had 2 weeks ago. Caleb was working on the barn roof when she returned, and he climbed down to meet her. "Well?" "We're legally married, and we have our loan." She dismounted, patting her horse's neck. "Now comes the hard part." "The hard part? Everything so far has been hard." "Everything so far has been preparation. Now we have to actually make this ranch profitable enough to meet our payments." She pulled out her notebook, which was already filling with calculations and plans. "We have 15 months to demonstrate viability. That means we need to show steady income, reduce debt, and improve property value. In 15 months. She started walking toward the house, and he fell into step beside her. "The apple operation is our immediate cash source. We should see returns within 2 weeks once the dried fruit is ready for market. The timber operation starts next week, which will bring in a lump sum. But those are one-time revenues. We need sustainable income streams." They spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing her detailed plans. Evelyn had broken down their strategy into quarterly goals, each building on the previous one. First quarter: establish immediate revenue sources and reduce unnecessary expenses. Second quarter: implement infrastructure improvements that would increase efficiency. Third quarter: expand into new revenue areas. Fourth quarter: demonstrate profitability and stable growth. "It's ambitious," Caleb said, reviewing the timeline. "It has to be. We're fighting against accumulated debt and community skepticism." She pointed to a section of her notes. "The biggest challenge will be the second quarter. We need to invest in improvements, but investment requires capital we don't have, so we need to find creative financing solutions." "Like what?" "Like trading services for materials, like negotiating payment plans with suppliers, like finding partners who'll invest in exchange for shares of specific revenues." She looked up at him. "This is where your knowledge of the community becomes crucial. I can design the strategy, but you know who to approach and how to approach them." Over the next 3 weeks, they fell into a rhythm of relentless activity. Caleb handled the physical labor while Evelyn managed the business operations, but the lines between their roles blurred constantly. He found himself pulled into negotiations, learning her methods. She found herself working alongside him in the fields, understanding the practical constraints that shaped their options. The dried apples sold better than expected. Mrs. Fletcher at the general store took the entire first batch and immediately ordered more. "City folks coming through on the railroad are paying premium prices for quality dried fruit," she explained. "You're the only supplier within 50 miles producing at this standard." But Evelyn had anticipated this, had researched what travelers wanted, had insisted on quality control that Caleb thought excessive. Now it was paying off. The timber operation brought in $300, more than Caleb had seen in cash in 2 years. He wanted to immediately pay down the loan, but Evelyn stopped him. "We need that capital for Phase 2 investments," she said. "Make the minimum loan payment, keep the rest liquid. But if we pay down the principal, we save $20 in interest over 15 months. If we invest that same money in hay equipment, we can generate an additional $200 this season." She showed him the calculations. "The mathematics are clear. We need to think strategically, not reactively." It went against every instinct Caleb had, but he'd learned to trust her judgment on financial matters. Still, watching that cash sit in their strongbox instead of going to pay off debt, made him nervous. Their first real test came in early October when Aaron Blackwell made his move. Caleb was checking fence line along the northern boundary when he spotted survey stakes that hadn't been there the day before. They were planted along the creek, marking what looked like a new property line, one that cut across land that was definitely part of the Boone Ranch. He rode back immediately and found Evelyn in the makeshift office she'd created in the dining room. "We have a problem." She looked up from her ledgers. "What kind?" "Blackwell's trying to steal our land. He's got survey stakes claiming the creek bend is on his property." Evelyn stood immediately. "Show me." They rode out together, and she examined the stakes with systematic care, checking them against the property deed she'd brought. Her expression grew grimmer with each measurement. "This is deliberate," she said finally. "These stakes represent about 40 acres, including our best water access." "I know. What do? "We respond strategically." She pulled out her notebook and started sketching. "This isn't just about land. It's about water rights and credibility. If Blackwell succeeds in this claim, it undermines our entire position. So we fight him? We outmaneuver him." She finished her sketch and showed him. "Look at this. He's claiming land that includes the creek bend, but the original survey documentation is ambiguous because the creek shifted course 20 years ago. He's exploiting that ambiguity." "How do you know this?" "Because I read every property deed in the county records. I wanted to understand our boundaries and any potential disputes." She tapped her pencil against the paper. "Blackwell thinks we're too weak and too ignorant to challenge him effectively. He's wrong on both counts. What's your plan?" "We need a formal resurvey by an independent surveyor, documented with territorial authority. We need to force this into legal channels where documentation matters more than intimidation." She looked at the stakes, her jaw set. "And we need to make this expensive enough for Blackwell that he thinks twice about trying again. Legal challenges cost money we don't have. Then we find creative solutions. Come on." She mounted her horse. "We're going to town." Judge Cooper listened to their case with interest, studying the property deeds and survey documentation Evelyn had assembled. "This is quite thorough, Mrs. Boone." "I believe in preparation, Your Honor." "So I see." He set down the papers. "The problem is, ordering an official resurvey requires filing fees and surveyor costs. Probably $200, maybe more." "We're prepared to pay," Evelyn said, though Caleb knew they absolutely weren't. That would consume most of their timber revenue. "However," Cooper continued, "if there's evidence of intentional fraud in the claim, which these overlapping documents suggest there might be, the party making the false claim could be liable for all costs plus damages." Evelyn leaned forward. "How would we establish fraud?" "You'd need to demonstrate that Blackwell knew his claim was invalid when he made it, that he had access to documentation showing the correct boundary and ignored it deliberately. The original survey records from territorial filing would show that." "They would, but those records are in the territorial capital. Getting copies would take weeks and cost money for official certification." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "What if someone had already obtained those records? What if they were available now?" Cooper raised an eyebrow. "That would expedite matters considerably. Do you have such records?" "Not yet, but I believe I can obtain them." She stood. "Thank you for your time, Your Honor. We'll return shortly." Outside, Caleb said, "How are you going to get records from the territorial capital in less than weeks?" "I'm going to write a very persuasive letter to the territorial surveyor's office, offering to pay for expedited certified copies, and I'm going to have it delivered by express rider." She was already walking toward the telegraph office. "It'll cost $30, but it'll save us from a much more expensive fight." "We don't have $30 for express delivery." "We do if I sell my mother's silver to Mrs. Fletcher." Caleb grabbed her arm. "No. That's yours, your only connection to your family." She looked at him, and he saw something vulnerable in her expression for the first time since she'd arrived. "My mother believed in practicality over sentiment. She'd tell me to sell the silver and save the ranch." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "Besides, sentiment doesn't pay bills. Evelyn, it's already decided." She gently pulled free and continued to the telegraph office. "Let's send this message before I change my mind." The records arrived 10 days later via express courier, and Evelyn immediately took them to Judge Cooper. The documentation was unambiguous. Blackwell's stakes were 40 acres into Boone property, and the historical survey records proved it conclusively. Cooper ordered the stakes removed, issued an injunction against further encroachment, and suggested that Blackwell might face fraud charges if he persisted. More importantly, he ordered Blackwell to pay the Boone's legal fees and survey costs. "That's $320, Cooper announced, payable within 30 days. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. They'd just forced Aaron Blackwell, the most powerful rancher in the county, to pay them. It seemed impossible, but Evelyn just nodded calmly, like she'd expected exactly this outcome. Because Caleb realized she had expected it. She'd planned for it, maneuvered toward it, and made it happen through pure strategic thinking. Word spread fast. The Eastern Bride had taken on Blackwell and won, had forced him to pay them money. The talk in town shifted from patronizing amusement to wary respect. But respect came with a price. 3 days after the judgment, they found 2 cattle dead in the north pasture, poisoned from the look of it. No proof of who did it, but the message was clear. Evelyn stood over the carcasses, her face pale, but her voice steady. "We need to secure the livestock, move them closer to the house where we can watch them. That means giving up the best grazing land. It means protecting our assets. We can't afford more losses." She turned to him. "This is retaliation. Blackwell's testing whether we'll break. And if we don't, then he'll escalate. Which means we need to escalate our defenses." She was already walking back to the house, her mind clearly racing through options. "We need help. Someone we can trust to watch the property when we can't. I told you I can't afford to not hire, partner with." She glanced back at him. "Is there anyone in the community who might have reason to want protection themselves? Someone else who's been threatened or squeezed out?" Caleb thought for a moment. "Tom Brennan, small homesteader east of here. Blackwell's been trying to force him off his land, too. But Tom's got even less money than we do." "Money isn't what we need. We need loyal eyes and an extra gun. What can we offer him?" "What do you mean?" "What does Tom need that we have? What could we trade?" Caleb considered. "Tom's trying to prove up his homestead claim. Needs to show improvements, fencing, structures. I've got fence materials I'm not using, and I know he needs help with building." "Perfect. We trade materials and your labor helping him build in exchange for him providing security here 2 days a week." Evelyn nodded, already incorporating this into her mental calculations. "Mutual protection. It works for both of us." Tom Brennan was a lanky man in his 30s with a wife and 2 small children. He listened to Evelyn's proposal with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust easy offers. "So you give me fence materials and help with building, and I come over here twice a week to watch your place," he summarized. "And we provide mutual warning if either of us faces threats," Evelyn added. "We're stronger together than separately. Blackwell preys on isolated homesteaders. If we create a network of mutual support, we become harder to intimidate." Tom looked at Caleb. "You trust her? This Eastern lady with all her fancy plans?" "I trust her more than I trust anyone else right now," Caleb said honestly. "She's kept this ranch alive when it should have died weeks ago." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand to Evelyn. "All right, Mrs. Boone, you got a deal." The arrangement worked better than expected. Tom was reliable and observant, and his wife Mary proved to be skilled at preserving food, which she taught Evelyn in exchange for access to their root cellar. The women formed a quiet friendship based on practical cooperation, and Caleb found himself valuing Tom's steady presence on the difficult days. But the pressure kept building. In November, when they tried to negotiate hay sales with the town's livery stable, the owner, a man who'd always been friendly, suddenly claimed he had sufficient supply. Same story at the other potential buyers. Someone had gotten to them first. "Blackwell?" Caleb said. "Has to be. He's trying to strangle our revenue streams. Then we find other buyers." Evelyn was already reviewing her market research. "There's a railroad depot 30 miles south, military post 40 miles north. We're not limited to local sales. Transportation costs will eat into profits. Some profit is better than no profit." She made notes. "Besides, if we establish relationships with outside buyers, it reduces our dependence on local goodwill. That's strategically valuable." They took a wagon load of hay south to the railroad depot. and negotiated a deal with the depot manager, who was happy to have local supply for the horses used in freight operations. The profit margin was smaller after transportation costs, but it established a precedent. They weren't trapped by local politics. Each small victory brought new challenges. The bank clerks started losing their payment documentation, requiring duplicate records. The town's blacksmith suddenly had no time for their repair work. Small acts of resistance that added friction to everything they did. But Evelyn documented every incident, kept meticulous records, and adapted their strategies constantly. She was learning the frontier as fast as Caleb had learned her business methods, understanding that power here flowed through informal networks and personal relationships, not just legal structures. "We need allies," she said one evening in late November as they reviewed their quarterly numbers. "Real allies, not just transaction partners. We have Tom. We need more. We need people with influence who see value in our success." She tapped her pencil against her ledger. Who in this county would benefit from seeing Blackwell's power challenged? Anyone Blackwell's ever squeezed, which is half the county. Then we need to make those people visible to each other. Show them they're not alone. Her eyes brightened with an idea. We need to host something, a gathering, something that brings people together and lets them see possibility. Like what? Like a harvest celebration. We've had a successful apple season. We can use that as the excuse. Invite all the small homesteaders, the independent ranchers, the townspeople who aren't in Blackwell's pocket. She was already planning it out. Make it about community, but really it's about showing strength and building networks. That'll cost money we don't have. We make it a potluck. Everyone brings something. We provide the location and the excuse. She smiled. Trust me, Mr. Boone. Sometimes the best investments are in relationships, not infrastructure. The harvest gathering happened on a cold Saturday in early December. They'd cleaned the barn, hung lanterns, and set up tables. Evelyn had sent personal invitations to 20 families, carefully choosing people she thought might be sympathetic. 15 families came, more than Caleb expected. Tom and Mary Brennan arrived early to help set up. Small homesteaders he barely knew showed up with covered dishes. Even a few townspeople came out, curious about the Eastern lady and her unusual ranch. Evelyn moved through the crowd with practiced grace, talking to everyone, learning their situations, making connections. Caleb watched her work and realized this was another kind of business, building social capital, creating networks of mutual interest. "Your wife is something else," Tom said, standing beside Caleb near the punch bowl. "Yeah, she is. Word is she made merchant restructure your loan and forced Blackwell to pay you money. That true?" "More or less." Tom whistled low. "And she's been here what, 2 months?" "About that." "Hell of a 2 months." Tom raised his cup in salute. "Here's to dangerous women with smart ideas." Caleb clinked his cup against Tom's, watching Evelyn laugh at something Mrs. Fletcher was saying. She looked different than she had that first day on the train platform. More confident, more integrated into this harsh place, but also more tired, carrying the weight of everything they were trying to accomplish. Near the end of the evening, Evelyn gathered everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for coming," she said, her voice carrying across the barn. "When I arrived here from the east, I didn't know what to expect, but I've learned something important these past months. This frontier can be harsh, but it doesn't have to be lonely. We're stronger when we work together, when we help each other, when we refuse to be isolated by those who profit from our division." There was a murmur of agreement, and Caleb saw several people nodding. "I'm not suggesting anything radical," Evelyn continued. "Just that we remember we're neighbors, that we look out for each other, that we share information and resources when we can." She smiled. "That's how communities survive. That's how we all survive." It wasn't quite a speech calling for organized resistance to Blackwell, but everyone understood the subtext. And when people left that night, they left with a sense of possibility, of being part of something larger than their individual struggles. The next morning, Caleb found Evelyn in the kitchen, going through yet another set of calculations. "That was well done last night," he said. "It was a start. We need to maintain those connections, keep building the network." She didn't look up from her work. "But we also need to address our immediate numbers. We've made good progress, but we're not profitable yet, not sustainably." "What are we missing?" "Scale. Everything we're doing works, but it's too small. We need bigger revenue streams." She finally looked up at him. Which brings me to something I've been researching. It's risky, but the potential return is significant. I'm almost afraid to ask. Water rights. Formal, legally documented water rights that we can lease to Blackwell and other downstream users. She pulled out a document she'd been preparing. The territorial government is implementing new water management regulations. If we file for formal appropriation rights now, we can establish legal control over creek usage. Then we charge access fees. That'll start a war. It'll start negotiations. There's a difference. She showed him her calculations. If we charge even modest fees to the 3 major downstream users, that's $300 annual revenue. Sustainable, passive income. Blackwell will fight this with everything he has. Probably. But the law is on our side, and we've already demonstrated we can win legal battles. She met his eyes. This is how we move from survival to stability. We monetize our strategic assets. As Caleb looked at the calculations, the legal research, the carefully constructed argument. It was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. When do we file? Tomorrow, before anyone knows what we're planning. She allowed herself a small smile. Speed is essential. They filed the water rights application at the Territorial Land Office the next day, with documentation so thorough that the clerk called it the most complete filing he'd ever processed. It would take weeks for approval, but once filed, it established their priority claim. News of the filing spread fast, and the reaction was immediate and furious. Blackwell showed up at their ranch 2 days later with 6 men, their horses churning mud in the yard. Caleb came out of the barn, rifle in hand, and found Evelyn already on the porch, calm and composed despite being outnumbered. "You've made a serious mistake," Blackwell said, not bothering to dismount. "We filed a legal application for water rights we're entitled to under territorial law," Evelyn replied. "That's not a mistake. It's business. This water has been free access for 30 years. And 30 years of precedent mean nothing against territorial statute. I've read the law, Mr. Blackwell. Have you?" She didn't wait for an answer. "Once our rights are approved, and they will be approved, you'll pay for water access or you'll lose your downstream grazing. Your choice." Blackwell's face went red. "You're making enemies you can't afford. We're claiming rights we can't afford not to claim." She remained perfectly still, but Caleb could see her hand gripping the porch railing. "The frontier is changing, Mr. Blackwell. Property rights are being formalized. Water law is being codified. You can adapt to the new system, or you can fight it and lose. Either way, we're moving forward." For a long moment, the tension hung thick in the cold air. Then Blackwell wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over." "I didn't expect it to be," Evelyn said to his retreating back. After they'd gone, Caleb climbed onto the porch beside her. She was trembling. "You all right?" he asked. "Just the aftermath. Fear catches up after the crisis passes." She took a shaky breath. "Do you think I pushed too hard?" "I think you did what needed doing, but he's right about one thing. This isn't over." "I know." She straightened her shoulders. "But we're not backing down. We've come too far to surrender now." That night, they heard riders in the darkness, and shots fired into the air near the barn. No damage, just intimidation. Caleb wanted to ride out after them, but Evelyn stopped him. "That's what they want, to provoke us into doing something rash that gives them excuse for retaliation." She was at the window, watching shadows in the moonlight. "We stay defensive. We document everything. We let them look like the aggressors. While they terrorize us? While they make mistakes." She turned to face him. "Blackwell's used to winning through intimidation, but intimidation only works if your opponent breaks. We're not breaking, so he'll escalate, and escalation makes him vulnerable to legal response. You're gambling that the law will protect us. I'm gambling that documented violence against law-abiding citizens will force Judge Cooper's hand. Blackwell's powerful, but he's not above the law. Not quite." Her expression was determined. "We just need to survive long enough for that to matter." The harassment continued sporadically over the next 3 weeks. Fence cutting, livestock harassment, anonymous threats left nailed to trees. Each incident was documented meticulously by Evelyn, with Tom Brennan serving as witness when possible. Through it all, they kept working. The hay sales continued. The dried apple operation expanded. Small victories accumulating against the backdrop of persistent threat. In January, the water rights approval came through. Evelyn held the official document like it was made of gold, reading it twice to make sure she understood correctly. "We won," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "We actually won. Now comes the hard part," Caleb said, "enforcing it." They sent formal notices to all downstream water users, including Blackwell, establishing the new fee structure. The fees were reasonable. Evelyn had calculated them carefully to be economically sustainable for users while generating needed revenue. But the principle was what mattered. Blackwell's response came 3 days later. He filed a lawsuit challenging the water rights approval, claiming improper procedure and harm to established use. It was clearly a stalling tactic meant to tie them up in expensive litigation. But Evelyn had anticipated this. She'd already contacted a lawyer in the territorial capital, a young attorney named Michael Hayes, who specialized in land use cases and was willing to work on contingency in exchange for a percentage of the water rights revenue. "He thinks we have a strong case," she told Caleb after receiving Hayes's telegram. "And he's willing to front the legal costs because he believes in the precedent this sets." Why would he do that? Because he's ambitious and smart. If he wins this case, it establishes his reputation as a water rights expert. That's worth more to him than immediate payment. She smiled. "See? Everyone has motivations that can be aligned with ours if you understand what they need." The lawsuit moved slowly through territorial courts, and while it did, their ranch continued its transformation. The quarterly numbers showed improvement, not profit yet, but reduced losses and positive trajectory. The network of small homesteaders they'd built at the harvest gathering was proving valuable, with information and resources flowing between farms. In February, something unexpected happened. 3 small ranchers approached them about forming a cooperative for bulk purchasing of supplies and shared equipment use. Evelyn had mentioned the concept at the harvest gathering, but she hadn't expected anyone to act on it. "Makes sense," Tom Brennan said, presenting the proposal. "We all need the same things. If we buy in bulk and share costs, we all save money. Simple mathematics." It was Evelyn's philosophy spreading through the community, her strategic thinking taking root in other people's operations. She helped them structure the cooperative, providing advice on legal organization and financial management. Caleb watched all this with a mixture of pride and amazement. "You're changing more than just our ranch," he told her one evening. "I'm just showing people what's possible when they think strategically instead of reactively." She was working on the cooperative's founding documents. But yes, I suppose change is happening. Whether that's good or bad remains to be seen. In March, the territorial court ruled in their favor. The water rights were upheld, and Blackwell was ordered to pay their legal fees plus the accumulated water access charges. The amount was substantial, over $800. When the judgment arrived, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table staring at it for a long time. Caleb came to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. "That's enough to make our loan payments for the rest of the year," he said quietly. "That's enough to do more than that." She looked up at him, and he saw tears in her eyes, the first time he'd seen her cry since she arrived. "We did it. We actually did it. We took a dying ranch and turned it into something viable. You did it. You're the one who saw all this potential." "We did it together." She stood and impulsively hugged him. It was the first real physical affection between them, despite being married for months, and it felt both natural and strange. Caleb held her, feeling the tension drain from her body, and understood how much pressure she'd been carrying. She'd been strong every day, strategic every moment, but underneath she'd been terrified of failure. "We're going to make it," he said into her hair. "We're going to do more than make it." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "We're going to thrive." But thriving, as Evelyn quickly learned, brought its own complications. Success made them visible in ways survival never had, and visibility attracted attention they didn't necessarily want. The first sign came from an unexpected direction. In late March, a well-dressed man arrived at the ranch driving a buggy that looked far too expensive for frontier roads. He introduced himself as Robert Hutchins, representative of the Western Agricultural Development Company out of Chicago. "I've been hearing remarkable things about your operation," Hutchins said, accepting the coffee Evelyn offered in the kitchen. "A restructured loan, successful legal challenges to established ranchers, innovative revenue diversification. You've made quite a name for yourself, Mrs. Boone." "We've simply tried to manage our resources effectively," Evelyn replied, settling into the chair across from him. Caleb stood near the stove, arms crossed, instinctively wary. Quite effectively, from what I understand, which is why my company is interested in discussing a potential partnership. Hutchins pulled out a folder of papers. We represent Eastern investors looking to develop frontier properties. Your ranch would be an ideal candidate for expansion with proper capital investment. What kind of partnership? Evelyn asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. We would provide capital for infrastructure improvements and operational expansion. In exchange, we'd take a controlling interest in the property, 60% ownership. You'd retain management control and receive guaranteed salaries plus profit sharing on the minority stake. Caleb straightened. You want us to sell you our ranch, not sell, partner. You'd maintain operational authority while we provide the resources for growth. Hutchins smiled smoothly. Think of what you could accomplish with real capital behind you. Modern equipment, expanded herds, professional staff. Your innovative approaches could be implemented at scale. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, and Caleb couldn't read her expression. She was studying Hutchins with that calculating look she got when processing complex information. That's a generous offer, she said finally, but I have questions. First, what happens if our management decisions conflict with your investors' interests? We discuss it and find compromise. Which means in practice that your investors would have final say since they control 60%. She set down her cup. Second question, what's your company's track record with similar partnerships? Hutchins hesitated just slightly. We facilitated several successful agricultural ventures. How many are still operated by the original families? Another pause. Business circumstances vary. Some families chose to exit their management roles after successful growth phases. Chose to exit, or were forced out when they disagreed with corporate direction? Evelyn's voice remained pleasant, but her eyes were sharp. Mr. Hutchins, I've read about companies like yours in the financial journals. You target struggling properties, promise capital and partnership, then systematically squeeze out the original owners once you control majority stake. It's legal, barely, but it's also predatory. Hutchins' smile tightened. I assure you, Mrs. Boone, we operate with complete integrity. I'm sure you believe that, but your definition of integrity and mine likely differ. She stood. Thank you for the offer, but we're not interested in partnerships that would dilute our control. We fought too hard to maintain independence to surrender it now. You're making a mistake. Capital is difficult to access on the frontier. Our offer provides resources you can't obtain elsewhere. Then we'll manage without those resources. We've gotten this far on strategy and determination. We'll continue on the same path. She walked to the door, clearly ending the conversation. I wish you success in finding other partnerships, Mr. Hutchins, just perhaps not with families who've actually read the fine print. After Hutchins left, driving away with considerably less confidence than he'd arrived with, Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Were you tempted, even for a moment? By the capital, yes. By the loss of control, not even slightly. Evelyn returned to her chair, suddenly looking tired. That's exactly the kind of offer that sounds good, until you're trapped in it. 5 years from now, we'd be employees on our own land, watching corporate investors make decisions that benefit Chicago bankers instead of Nebraska ranchers. But the money would have made things easier. Easier isn't always better, and independence is worth more than ease. She picked up her ledger, returning to work like the interruption had never happened. Besides, we don't need their money. We're going to generate our own capital through operations. It'll be slower, but it'll be ours. Caleb watched her work, marveling again at her combination of pragmatism and principle. She could calculate profit to the penny, but she wouldn't compromise core values for financial gain. It was a rare combination, and he was realizing how much he'd come to depend on it. The seasonal shift to spring brought new opportunities and new challenges. The hay meadow needed planting, cattle needed moving to fresh pasture, and the apple trees required pruning and care to ensure next season's crop. Physical work that Caleb understood, that made sense in his bones. But Evelyn was already thinking 3 steps ahead, planning summer operations and fall revenues. She'd identified a new opportunity. The railroad depot they'd sold hay to was expanding operations and needed reliable local suppliers for multiple products, not just hay. They're building a freight warehouse and livestock pens, she explained, reviewing the information she'd gathered on her last trip to the depot. They'll need lumber for construction, hay for the horses, and eventually beef for the railroad crews. If we position ourselves as their primary local supplier, that's a stable revenue stream for the next 2 years at least. We can't provide all of that ourselves. We don't have to. We become the aggregator. We contract with other local producers, Tom's lumber from his timber, the Petersons' beef cattle, our hay, and whatever else we can supply. We take a coordination fee for managing the relationship and ensuring quality. She was sketching out the structure as she talked. It's the same principle as the cooperative, but more formalized. We become the reliable local contact point between frontier production and railroad demand. That's getting complicated. Business is complicated, but this kind of complexity is valuable. It creates relationships and dependencies that stabilize everything else we're doing. She looked up at him. Trust me on this one. He did trust her, which was itself remarkable given how skeptical he'd been of her approaches initially. But every prediction she'd made had come true. Every strategy had worked or been quickly adapted when it didn't. She'd earned his trust through demonstrated competence. They spent April building those railroad relationships, with Evelyn negotiating contracts and Caleb managing the logistics of actually delivering products. It required coordination with 6 different local producers, complex scheduling, and constant quality control. But by month's end, they had a framework that was generating steady income for multiple families while positioning the Boone Ranch as a crucial node in the local economy. "You're making us important," Tom Brennan observed one evening when he'd stopped by to discuss a lumber delivery. "Not just successful, important. People depend on us now." "Importance is insurance," Evelyn replied. "The more integrated we are into the community's economic fabric, the harder we are to attack. Blackwell can't move against us without disrupting everyone connected to us. That's smart and a little bit ruthless. Welcome to frontier business." But she smiled when she said it, taking the edge off. The ruthlessness showed itself when Silas Merchant made his next move. He'd been quiet since the loan restructuring, but in early May he appeared at the ranch with an unexpected proposal. "I've been impressed by your operation, Mrs. Boone," he said, sitting in the same kitchen chair where Hutchins had sat weeks before. "You've demonstrated exceptional financial acumen, which is why I'd like to offer you a position." Evelyn's eyebrows rose. "A position?" "As financial consultant to the bank. We're expanding operations and we need someone who understands both traditional banking and frontier economics. You'd be ideal." He named a salary that made Caleb's eyes widen. "You could continue living here, working from town 2 days a week. It would provide substantial steady income while you continue developing the ranch." It was a clever offer, Caleb had to admit. The salary alone would solve most of their remaining financial pressures. And it seemed to acknowledge Evelyn's abilities in a way frontier society typically didn't for women. But Evelyn just smiled coldly. "Mr. Merchant, that's a fascinating attempt to neutralize a threat by co-opting it, but I'm afraid I must decline." Merchant's pleasant expression cracked slightly. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do. You're offering me a salary and status in exchange for my time, energy, and most importantly, my independence. Once I'm working for you, I can't challenge you. I can't advise other farmers on how to resist predatory loans. I can't build alternative financial structures that compete with your bank." She leaned forward. "You're trying to buy my silence and my strategic thinking." "The answer is no. You're being paranoid. I'm being realistic. And I'm also being busy building something you can't control, which clearly bothers you." She stood. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in working for someone whose business model I fundamentally oppose. Good day, Mr. Merchant." After he left, Caleb said, "That was a lot of money." "It was a gilded cage. I didn't escape one form of dependence to walk into another." She returned to her ledgers, but her hand was shaking slightly. "Though I admit, turning down that salary hurt more than I expected. We're doing all right financially now. We're stable, not comfortable. There's a difference." She set down her pen and looked at him directly. "But comfort at the cost of compromise isn't worth it. I'd rather struggle independently than prosper under someone else's control." It was a statement of principle that Caleb recognized as core to who she was. Evelyn valued autonomy above almost everything else, would sacrifice security for freedom. It made her difficult to intimidate or bribe, which was probably why Merchant and Blackwell found her so threatening. The community cooperative she had helped establish was flourishing, with 12 families now participating in bulk purchasing and equipment sharing. But success attracted friction from those who profited from the old system. The general store owner complained about lost sales. The tool rental business claimed unfair competition, small grievances that accumulated into pressure. The pressure crystallized in June when the town council called a special meeting to discuss unfair commercial practices disrupting established business. Evelyn attended with Caleb and Tom Brennan, and they found themselves facing a room of hostile merchants led by Silas Merchant himself. This cooperative arrangement is undermining legitimate businesses, Merchant argued to the council. These farmers are essentially operating a commercial enterprise without proper licensing or taxation. We're neighbors sharing resources, Evelyn countered calmly. There's no commercial enterprise. No one's making profit. We're just reducing individual costs through collective action. You're coordinating commercial activity. That requires business licensing under territorial law. Judge Cooper, serving as council chairman, looked troubled. Mrs. Boone, is there commercial coordination happening? There's coordination, yes, but no commercial profit. Every member pays cost share for materials and services. There's no markup, no profit margin. She'd brought documentation, naturally. Here are the cooperative's complete financial records. You'll see every transaction is at-cost distribution among members. Merchant leaned forward. But Mrs. Boone herself takes a coordination fee for managing these arrangements. A coordination fee that barely covers administrative time and is distributed as credits against future cost sharing, not as cash income. Evelyn's voice remained steady. Mr. Merchant, this isn't about business law. This is about your desire to maintain control over rural purchasing power. You don't want farmers negotiating bulk rates because it reduces your profit margins. That's slander. That's accurate economic analysis. She turned to face the full council. Gentlemen, 12 families are saving an average of $30 per month through this cooperative. That's money that stays in their pockets, instead of going to inflated prices from monopolistic local merchants. If you shut down this arrangement, you're telling those families that established business profits matter more than their economic survival. One council member, a dry goods merchant named Patterson, spoke up. But Mrs. Boone, we have families to feed too. Our businesses depend on reasonable profit margins. Reasonable being the key word. The margins you were charging were not reasonable. They were exploitative, made possible by lack of alternatives. Evelyn's tone softened slightly. I'm not trying to destroy anyone's business, but I am trying to create economic balance. Perhaps instead of attacking the cooperative, you should consider why families felt the need to create alternatives to your services. The debate continued for 2 more hours, with arguments becoming increasingly heated. Finally, Judge Cooper called for order and announced the council would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 2 weeks. Walking out of the meeting hall, Tom Brennan shook his head. That didn't go as well as I'd hoped. It went exactly as I expected, Evelyn said. They're scared because we're changing power dynamics, but they can't legally stop us, which means they're just posturing. She paused at the edge of the boardwalk, looking at the darkening street. Though we should prepare for the possibility that they'll find some legal technicality to cause trouble. She was right, as usual. The council's ruling came down exactly 2 weeks later. The cooperative was legal but would be subject to quarterly reporting requirements and oversight by a council-appointed auditor. It was harassment disguised as regulation, designed to create bureaucratic burden. But Evelyn had anticipated this. She volunteered to serve as the cooperative's certified record keeper, met every reporting requirement with meticulous precision, and turned the auditing process into an opportunity to document just how much money families were saving. Within 3 months, the auditor himself was recommending that other communities adopt similar cooperative models. You turned their weapon against them, Caleb observed after the 3rd audit report came back praising the cooperative's transparency and economic benefits. I just gave them enough rope to prove our case, Evelyn replied. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. They wanted oversight. I gave them so much documentation they couldn't help but see the truth. By late summer, the ranch's transformation was undeniable. The quarterly numbers showed actual profit, not just reduced losses, but genuine positive returns. The loan payments were being met comfortably with money left over for improvements. The cattle herd was growing, the apple operation was expanding, and the railroad contracts were providing steady baseline income. But success brought its own exhaustion. Evelyn was working 16-hour days, managing the ranch operations, the cooperative coordination, the ongoing legal documentation, and the constant strategic planning. Caleb watched her grow thinner, saw the shadows under her eyes deepen, and worried. "You need to rest," he told her one August evening when he found her still working at midnight. "I need to finish these projections for next quarter. They can wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow, I need to review the railroad contracts and prepare the cooperative's quarterly report and coordinate with Tom about the fall harvest schedule." She didn't look up from her papers. "There aren't enough hours as it is." "Evelyn?" He took the pen from her hand gently. "You're going to collapse if you keep this pace." "I can't afford to collapse. Too many people depend on us now." But her voice wavered slightly, and he saw her hands trembling. "Those people will still need us tomorrow, but they need us functional, not burnt out." He pulled her to her feet. "Come on. You're going to bed." "I'm not finished." "Yes, you are. For tonight, you're finished." He kept his voice firm but gentle. "The work will still be there in the morning. You won't be useful to anyone if you work yourself into exhaustion." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw the fear beneath her determination. Fear that if she stopped, everything would fall apart. That the ranch would fail, the cooperative would collapse. All these people depending on them would be left stranded. "It's all balanced on the edge," she whispered. "One mistake, one missed opportunity, and it could all come crashing down. Then we'll be sure not to make that mistake, together." He guided her toward the stairs. "But we can't make good decisions when we're exhausted. Strategic thinking requires a clear mind, and you've been running on determination instead of rest for weeks now." She nodded slowly, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the exhaustion. "Just tonight. Tomorrow Tomorrow we'll figure out how to distribute some of this work so it's not all on your shoulders." He waited while she climbed the stairs, noticing how heavily she leaned on the railing. "You've built something remarkable here, Evelyn, but you can't sustain it alone." But that conversation led to changes in how they operated. Evelyn began training Tom's wife, Mary, on basic bookkeeping so she could handle some of the routine financial tracking. They hired a teenage boy from town, Jacob Miller, to help with physical labor and errands, freeing both Caleb and Evelyn for more strategic work. Small delegations that added up to meaningful relief. But the pressure from outside continued building. In September, a new threat emerged when territorial officials announced they were reviewing all water rights claims filed in the past year. It was clearly targeted at their creek rights. Someone with influence had gotten to the territorial office. "Blackwell," Caleb said when they received the review notice. "Has to be. He's got connections in the capital." "Of course he does. Men like Blackwell always have connections." Evelyn was already drafting a response, assembling documentation. "But connections don't override law. Our claim is solid. Unless they change the law." She paused, pen hovering over paper. "That's actually a legitimate concern. If they're reviewing existing claims, they might be preparing to modify the water rights framework itself." Her mind was clearly racing through implications. "We need information. We need to know what's being discussed at the territorial level before it becomes policy." "How do we get that information?" "We go to the source." She set down her pen with decision. "I need to travel to the territorial capital, talk to officials directly, understand what's happening, and advocate for our interests before decisions get made. That's a week of travel each way, plus time there. We can't both go. You stay here and manage operations. I'll go alone." She was already planning it out. "I'll take the train from the railroad depot, stay in the capital for a week, meet with whoever I can access, then return. 2.5 weeks total. I don't like you traveling alone." "I'm not asking permission, Caleb. I'm telling you what needs to happen." But her voice softened. "I know it's a risk, but this water rights issue is existential. If we lose those rights, we lose a crucial revenue stream and legal precedent. I have to go." He wanted to argue, wanted to insist it was too dangerous or too exhausting or too something. But he recognized the look in her eyes. This was who she was. Someone who moved toward problems instead of away from them. "All right," he said finally, "but you take enough money for decent lodging and meals, and you wire me every other day so I know you're safe." "Agreed." She stood and, surprising him, kissed his cheek. "Thank you for trusting me. I trust your judgment. Doesn't mean I won't worry. Worry is acceptable. Interference isn't." But she smiled when she said it, taking the sting out. She left 3 days later, dressed in her most professional Eastern attire, carrying a leather case stuffed with documentation and a determination that bordered on fierce. Caleb watched her board the train at the depot and felt a curious mix of pride and anxiety. Tom Brennan, who'd driven them to the depot, said, "That's one hell of a woman you married." "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "She is." The ranch felt strangely empty without her. Caleb hadn't realized how much her presence had become the anchor of daily operations until that presence was absent. He managed the physical work competently, that was familiar territory, but the strategic decisions felt heavier without her input. The first wire came 2 days later. Arrived safely. Stop meeting scheduled. Stop situation complex. Stop. More soon. Complex was Evelyn's way of saying concerning. Caleb tried not to read too much into it. 3 days after that, another wire. Water rights review, politically motivated. Stop. Blackwell has allies in capital. Stop fighting on multiple fronts. Stop staying longer. That one made Caleb's stomach clench. If Blackwell had enough influence to reach territorial politics, they were fighting a more powerful enemy than he'd realized. But 5 days after that, a longer wire arrived. Success Stop testified before review committee. Stop provided evidence of existing rights and economic benefits. Stop committee recommends no changes to current framework. Stop Blackwell allies outvoted. Stop returning tomorrow. She arrived back at the ranch 2 days later, exhausted but triumphant. Caleb met her at the depot, and she practically fell into his arms. "I'm so tired I could sleep for a week," she said into his shoulder. "Then that's what you'll do." "Can't. Too much work accumulated while I was gone." "The work can wait. You need rest." He helped her into the wagon. "But first, tell me what happened." During the ride home, she described the week in the capital. Meetings with territorial officials, testimony before committees, navigation of political networks that made frontier power struggles look simple by comparison. She documented everything, built coalitions with other water rights holders, and ultimately convinced enough committee members that changing the framework would create more problems than it solved. Blackwell tried to paint small water rights holders as troublemakers disrupting traditional use, she explained. But I showed them the economic data, showed how formalized rights actually increase agricultural productivity and investment, made it about territorial development instead of individual disputes. She leaned against Caleb's shoulder, her exhaustion evident. I also may have implied that Eastern investment groups were watching how the territory handled property rights, and arbitrary changes would discourage capital investment. You bluffed. I strategically emphasized certain possibilities. She managed a tired smile. But it worked. The committee voted to maintain current framework and actually strengthen protections for existing claims. So we won. We survived. There's a difference. She closed her eyes. But yes, for now, we won. Over the next few weeks, as Evelyn recovered her strength, Caleb saw how the capital trip had changed her. She was more confident in her strategic abilities, but also more aware of how fragile their position remained. One political shift, one powerful enemy with the right connections, and everything could still crumble. "We need to build stronger defenses," she said one evening as they reviewed their situation. "Not just economic or legal defenses, political defenses. We need allies with real influence, not just local farmers." How do we get that kind of influence? We become the story that matters. The Eastern bride who saved a dying ranch, who challenged corruption, who built community prosperity. She was thinking out loud now, planning. Regional newspapers would be interested in that narrative. It's frontier romance with economic substance, and media attention creates political protection. You want to invite reporters to write about us? I want to control our narrative before someone else does. Blackwell and Merchant have been defining us as troublemakers. I'd rather be defined as innovators. She made notes. I'll write to the Omaha Herald and the Denver Post. Human interest story with economic angles. They love this kind of thing. It seemed risky to Caleb, inviting outside scrutiny, but he'd learned to trust Evelyn's instincts about these things. And sure enough, within 2 months, a reporter from the Omaha Herald arrived to interview them about their remarkable frontier success story. The resulting article, published in December, was everything Evelyn had hoped for. It portrayed them as examples of frontier ingenuity and determination, highlighted their innovative economic approaches, and even mentioned the resistance they'd faced from established interests without naming names. The article was picked up by several other papers, and suddenly they had a public profile that extended far beyond their county. "That was brilliant," Tom Brennan said after reading the article. "Now you're not just local troublemakers. You're regional success stories, much harder to attack." "That's the idea," Evelyn agreed. "Visibility is protection. The more public we are, the more careful our enemies have to be." But visibility also attracted new complications. By January, they'd received 3 more offers from investment companies wanting to partner on expansion. A Chicago newspaper wanted to interview Evelyn about women's roles in frontier economics. A group of territorial legislators asked her to consult on agricultural development policy. "You're becoming famous," Caleb observed, watching her sort through the latest correspondence. "I'm becoming a symbol. There's a difference." She set aside the letters with visible irritation. "These people don't care about our actual ranch. They care about what we represent, proof that frontier economics can be rationalized and modernized. I'm useful to them as an example, not as a person. So what do you do with all this attention? Use what's useful, deflect the rest." She pulled out one letter. "This one's interesting, though. It's from a women's business association in Omaha. They want to know if I'd speak at their annual conference about frontier enterprise strategies." "You should do it. It's 3 days of travel, 2 days in Omaha. That's almost a week away from the ranch. The ranch will survive a week, and it could be valuable, building connections with business women who might become allies or partners." Caleb was learning to think strategically himself now, after months of watching Evelyn. "Besides, you should get recognition for what you've accomplished, not just for strategic reasons, because you deserve it." She looked at him, surprised and touched. Their relationship had evolved gradually over the months from strategic partnership to something deeper, though neither had quite articulated what that something was. They worked together, planned together, fought challenges together. Whatever that made them, it felt solid in ways Caleb hadn't expected. "All right," she said finally. "I'll do it, but you're in charge while I'm gone, which means you'll need to handle the quarterly report and the cooperative coordination. You'll have to teach me. That's the point. We need redundancy. If either of us becomes indispensable, we create vulnerability." She was already pulling out ledgers to show him procedures. "This is how we prepare for sustainability, not just survival." The spring of their second year together brought a sense of stability they hadn't dared imagine a year before. The loan payments were being met comfortably. The ranch operations were diversified and productive. The cooperative was thriving. They'd not only survived, they'd succeeded in ways that seemed impossible back when Evelyn first stepped off that train. But they both knew better than to become complacent. The frontier was unforgiving to those who stopped adapting, and their enemies hadn't disappeared, just retreated to plot new approaches. The attack, when it came, was from an unexpected direction. In April, Judge Cooper summoned them to town on urgent business. They arrived to find Cooper looking troubled and uncomfortable. "I've received a formal complaint," he said without preamble, "from a citizens group claiming that your cooperative arrangement constitutes an illegal restraint of trade under territorial commerce laws." Evelyn went still. "What citizens group?" "It's filed anonymously as a collective of concerned merchants." "Meaning Silas Merchant organized it, but doesn't want his name attached." She was already thinking through implications. "What's the specific claim?" "That by coordinating purchasing and negotiating bulk rates, you're creating an artificial monopoly that prevents legitimate competition. They're asking for injunctive relief to dissolve the cooperative pending a full legal review." "That's absurd. We're not preventing competition, we're creating market efficiency." "I agree it's likely without merit, but the law requires me to schedule a hearing. And until that hearing, I have to issue a temporary restraining order on cooperative purchasing activities." The impact hit immediately. 12 families that had been relying on cooperative purchasing were suddenly cut off from the cost savings that had been helping them stay solvent. The spring planting season was beginning, and without coordinated bulk purchasing, several families couldn't afford necessary seed and supplies. Evelyn spent 3 days preparing for the hearing, assembling economic documentation and legal precedents. Caleb watched her drive herself toward exhaustion again, fueled by anger and determination. "They're attacking the wrong people," she muttered, reviewing testimony notes. These families are barely surviving. Taking away the cooperative's benefits could push some of them into foreclosure, which is probably the point. More foreclosures mean more land for merchant to acquire. Then we need to make sure that strategy fails. She looked up at him with fierce resolve. At the hearing, I want you to testify. Tell them what life was like before the cooperative. Make it personal, not just economic. The hearing took place on a cold April morning in the town hall. The room was packed. All the cooperative families had come to witness, along with various townspeople curious about the controversy. Merchant sat in the front row, looking satisfied. Evelyn presented first, laying out the economic case with systematic precision. She demonstrated that the cooperative didn't restrict trade. It simply allowed small buyers to negotiate with sellers more effectively. That bulk purchasing was standard business practice across the country and couldn't legally be prohibited just because it was being done collectively by farmers rather than individually by merchants. Then Caleb testified, and he spoke from the heart about what the cooperative had meant, about families who could finally afford decent equipment, about children who had better food because parents saved money on supplies, about hope returning to homesteads that had been slowly dying. These aren't rich people gaming the system, he said, looking directly at the judge. These are hardworking families trying to survive on harsh land with minimal margins. The cooperative didn't hurt legitimate business. It just reduced excessive profits built on those families' desperation. When the testimony concluded, Judge Cooper took less than an hour to deliberate. He returned with a decision that dissolved the restraining order and dismissed the complaint entirely. The cooperative arrangement is clearly legal under territorial law, Cooper ruled. It represents standard market activity, buyers negotiating collectively for better terms. This court will not prohibit such activity simply because it disadvantages merchants who previously enjoyed monopolistic pricing power. He looked at Merchant directly. Furthermore, filing frivolous complaints to harass legal business activity is itself a violation of legal ethics. This court warns against future such actions. It was a complete victory, and more than that, it was a public rebuke of Merchant's tactics. The crowd applauded, and several cooperative families surrounded Evelyn and Caleb with gratitude and relief. But as they walked out of the town hall, Evelyn said quietly, "This isn't over. We embarrassed Merchant publicly. He won't forgive that. Let him come. We'll handle whatever he throws at us." "I hope so." She looked tired despite the victory. "But I'm starting to wonder if we'll ever reach a point where we're not constantly fighting." It was a question Caleb couldn't answer because he wondered the same thing. They'd achieved so much, but the constant battles were exhausting. Every victory seemed to just raise the stakes for the next confrontation. That night, lying awake, Caleb thought about the path they'd traveled. From that first desperate conversation on the train platform to this moment of hard-won success. They'd built something remarkable, something that mattered to dozens of families now. But the cost was visible in Evelyn's exhausted face, in his own constant tension, in the way they could never quite relax because the next threat was always emerging. Was this what success looked like on the frontier? Not peace, not comfort, but constant strategic warfare to maintain what you'd built? He didn't have an answer, but watching Evelyn sleep beside him, finally resting after days of desperate preparation, he knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, they'd face it together. That partnership, built through shared struggle and mutual respect, was the strongest thing they'd created. And maybe that was enough. The answer to that question came sooner than either of them expected, and from a direction that blindsided them completely. 3 weeks after the cooperative hearing victory, Caleb was in town purchasing supplies when he overheard a conversation in the general store that made his blood run cold. Two men he didn't recognize were discussing the Bank of Ashford's financial situation with Mrs. Fletcher in voices just loud enough to carry. "Heard Merchant's in trouble with the regional banking authority," one said. "Something about irregular lending practices and insufficient reserves." "About time someone investigated him," Mrs. Fletcher replied, though she kept her voice neutral. "Been rumors for years about his accounting." "Word is they're sending auditors next month. If they find what people think they'll find, the bank could be seized." Caleb finished his purchases quickly and rode back to the ranch at a pace that had his horse snorting protest. He found Evelyn in the office, working through yet another set of projections. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. She looked up, immediately alert to his tone. "What kind?" The kind where our biggest enemy might be about to collapse, taking everyone connected to him down too. He explained what he'd overheard and watched her face go through several rapid calculations. If the bank fails, our loan gets transferred to whoever acquires the assets, she said slowly. Which could be anyone. Could be someone worse than merchant. Or could be someone who doesn't honor the restructured terms, who demands immediate payment in full. How much do we still owe? She was already pulling out the loan documents. About $600. We've been paying it down ahead of schedule, but that's still more than we have in liquid capital. Evelyn stood and walked to the window, staring out at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. We need information, real information, not general store gossip. We need to know exactly what's happening with that bank investigation. How do we get that? I go to the regional banking office, same way I went to the territorial capital, directly to the source. She was already thinking through the logistics. It's in Omaha, 3 days by train. I can claim I'm there for that women's business conference they invited me to, make inquiries while I'm in the city. That's only 2 weeks away. If auditors are coming next month, we don't have much time, which is why I leave tomorrow. She turned back to him, her jaw set with determination. This is too important to delay. Evelyn, you just got back from a week in town for the hearing. You're exhausted. I'll rest when we're secure. Right now, we need to understand the threat. She moved past him toward the stairs. I'll pack tonight. Leave at dawn. You'll need to handle the railroad delivery scheduled for Thursday, and Tom said he'd help with the fence repairs on the north boundary. Caleb caught her arm gently. Wait a moment. She stopped, and he saw the fear beneath her determination, the same fear he felt, that after all this work, all these victories, they could still lose everything to circumstances beyond their control. We'll figure this out, he said. Whatever's happening with Merchants Bank, we'll find a way through it. You don't know that. No, but I know we've survived worse, and I know you're the smartest, most strategic person I've ever met. If anyone can navigate this, it's you. He pulled her into an embrace, feeling her tension gradually ease slightly. But you can't do it running on fumes. Get some rest tonight. Start fresh tomorrow. She nodded against his shoulder, and for a moment they just stood there, holding each other against the uncertainty of what was coming. The trip to Omaha revealed a situation worse than they'd feared. Evelyn met with her contact from the Women's Business Association, who had connections to the regional banking authority through her husband's law practice. What she learned made the long train ride back to Nebraska feel like it passed in mere seconds, her mind racing through implications. Merchant had been running the Bank of Ashford like his personal empire, using depositor funds for speculative land investments and making predatory loans that showed as assets on paper but were backed by properties of dubious value. When agricultural prices fell, those properties became worthless, but Merchant kept reporting them at inflated values to hide the losses. The regional authority was sending auditors because multiple complaints had been filed, not by borrowers but by larger banks that had correspondent relationships with Merchant and were concerned about their exposure. When the audit happened, the bank would almost certainly be declared insolvent and placed in receivership. All outstanding loans would be called in for immediate payment or transferred to the acquiring institution under whatever terms that institution chose to offer. The restructured terms Evelyn had fought so hard to negotiate would become meaningless. She arrived back at the ranch on a Friday evening to find Caleb waiting anxiously on the porch. One look at her face told him the news wasn't good. How bad? He asked. Worse than bad. The bank's essentially insolvent. When it fails, and it will fail, we'll have maybe 2 weeks to come up with full payment or risk losing everything. She climbed down from the wagon slowly, every movement showing exhaustion. We're back where we started, facing foreclosure with no clear way out. They went inside and she laid out everything she'd learned. The timeline, the probable outcomes, the limited options available to them. As she talked, Caleb felt a familiar desperation rising, the same feeling he'd had that day on the train platform when he'd confessed the truth to a stranger who'd just become his only hope. $600 in 2 weeks, he said when she finished. We don't have it. Even if we sold everything we could sell, we'd come up short. I know. Evelyn's voice was flat with exhaustion and defeat. I've been running numbers the entire trip back. Every scenario ends with us short of what we need. Could we get another loan from a different bank? Not fast enough. And not without the current loan being resolved first. No bank will lend when there's existing debt in uncertain status. She slumped in her chair, and Caleb saw something he'd never seen before. Evelyn looking truly beaten. I don't know what to do. For the first time since I arrived here, I don't see a path forward. The admission hit harder than any of the bad news. Evelyn always had a plan, always saw angles others missed. Her strategic thinking had been their salvation over and over. If she couldn't find a solution, maybe there wasn't one. They sat in silence as darkness fell outside, both of them trying to think through a problem that seemed to have no solution. Finally, Caleb said, "What if we went directly to whoever's likely to acquire the bank? Negotiated with them before the transfer happens." That's assuming we can identify them and that they'd negotiate with individual borrowers before the acquisition is finalized. Both unlikely. But he saw her mind starting to engage with the possibility, working the angles. Though there might be something there. If we could identify the acquiring institution and demonstrate our loan is actually valuable, that we're reliable payers with a profitable operation, they might agree to maintain current terms. How do we find out who's acquiring it? The same way I found out about the audit, through connections in Omaha. She stood, moving toward her desk where her correspondence was stacked. The attorney who helped me with information has contacts in banking circles. If anyone knows who's positioning to acquire merchants' assets, it would be him. That's another trip to Omaha. No, that's a very expensive telegram asking very specific questions. She was already drafting the message in her mind. And then, potentially yes, another trip to Omaha if the answer provides an opening we can exploit. You can't keep doing this, running back and forth, pushing yourself to exhaustion. I can if it means saving what we've built. Her voice was sharp with stress. Caleb, we're out of options. This is the only play I see. Then let me go. Tell me what to say, who to talk to, and I'll handle it. She looked at him with surprise and something else, gratitude maybe, or relief. You'd do that? We're partners. That means we share burdens, not just victories. He moved to stand beside her. I can't do the strategic thinking like you can, but I can follow your plan. Tell me what needs to happen, and I'll make it happen. For a moment, emotion flickered across her face, quickly controlled but visible. All right, we'll do it together. I'll send the telegram, and while we wait for response, we'll prepare documentation showing our ranch's profitability and reliability. If we get an opportunity to present our case, we need to be ready. The telegram response came back 2 days later, and it contained both good news and complicated news. The acquiring institution was likely to be the First National Bank of Omaha, a large regional bank with a reputation for sound practices. They were known to honor reasonable loan terms when acquiring distressed banks' assets, but they were also known to be cautious, requiring significant documentation and proof of borrower reliability before making any commitments. This could work, Evelyn said, reading the telegram for the third time. First National is exactly the kind of institution that would recognize our operation's value, but we need to get to them before the acquisition is finalized, while they're still evaluating which loans to honor versus which to call in. When does the acquisition finalize? Probably 3 to 4 weeks. The audit has to complete first. She was already making lists. We need to prepare a complete financial package. 2 years of operation history showing consistent improvement, reliable payments, diversified income streams. We need to demonstrate we're a good loan, not a risky one. They spent the next week assembling the most comprehensive documentation either of them had ever created. Every transaction, every payment, every revenue stream was documented and organized. Evelyn wrote a narrative explaining their operation strategy and growth trajectory. Caleb gathered testimonials from their business partners, the railroad depot, the lumber crew, even some of the cooperative families who could attest to their reliability and community impact. The package they created was impressive, a testament to everything they'd accomplished in less than 2 years. Looking at it laid out on the kitchen table, Caleb felt a surge of pride despite the desperation of their situation. "This is good work," he said. "It's a strong case. Whether it's strong enough depends on who reviews it and what their priorities are." Evelyn was already packing it carefully into a leather portfolio. "We need to deliver this personally, both of us. Show them we're serious, professional, invested. When do we leave?" "Tomorrow. The railroad schedule has a train leaving at dawn." She looked at him directly. "This is everything, Caleb. This meeting determines whether we keep fighting or whether we lose it all. I know. And if we lose, she trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. We won't lose. We've come too far, fought too hard. We're going to walk into that bank, present our case, and convince them we're worth keeping. He said it with more confidence than he felt, but sometimes confidence was its own kind of strategy. They left Tom Brennan in charge of the ranch and caught the dawn train to Omaha. The ride gave them time to rehearse their presentation, anticipate questions, and prepare counter-arguments. Evelyn was in full strategic mode, and Caleb found himself learning from her even in the midst of crisis. The way she thought through angles, prepared for contingencies, always had a backup position ready. First National Bank of Omaha occupied an impressive brick building in the city's financial district. It looked solid, established, exactly the kind of institution that inspired confidence, which made Caleb nervous because he was just a frontier rancher in his best clothes, about to ask sophisticated city bankers to take a risk on him. But Evelyn walked in like she belonged there, her Eastern polish serving as perfect armor. She requested a meeting with the officer handling the merchant bank acquisition, and her combination of confidence and documented business gave them access they probably shouldn't have had. The officer was a man named Harrison Wright, middle-aged and skeptical, with the kind of careful expression that suggested he'd heard every hard luck story and believed none of them. He reviewed their documentation with practiced efficiency while they sat across his massive desk, waiting. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Wright looked up. "This is quite thorough. You've documented everything clearly." "We believe in complete transparency," Evelyn said. "We want you to see exactly what our operation is and what its prospects are. I can see that you've turned around a failing ranch and established multiple revenue streams. That's admirable." He set down the papers. "But I need to understand something. Why should First National maintain your restructured loan terms when we could simply call the loan and acquire the property for a fraction of its value?" It was the question they'd been expecting, the crucial moment. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "Because the property is worth more to you performing than foreclosed, Mr. Wright. If you call our loan and force foreclosure, you acquire land in a depressed market that will take months to sell, generating no income while you carry it. You'll likely sell for less than loan value, taking a loss." She pulled out a specific document. "But if you maintain our restructured terms, you have a reliable borrower making consistent payments at reasonable interest. Over the remaining loan term, you'll recover full principal plus interest. Better return, lower risk, and you maintain good community relationships that benefit your other operations in the territory." Wright considered this. "You're assuming we can't sell the property quickly for more than loan value." "I'm stating market reality. Rural property values are depressed, and this specific property has been publicly associated with financial distress due to merchants' predatory practices. That stigma affects value." She met his eyes directly. "But our operation's success is equally public. Regional newspapers have covered our turnaround. We've built relationships with multiple commercial entities who depend on our reliability. That reputation has value too, value that transfers to any bank that chooses to work with us rather than against us." It was brilliantly argued, and Caleb saw Wright's expression shift slightly. He was at least considering it. "What about the risk that you fail anyway?" Wright asked. "That we maintain terms and 6 months from now you default?" "That risk exists with any loan," Caleb said, speaking up for the first time. "But look at our trend line. Every quarter we're stronger. Every month we're more diversified. We're not gambling on luck. We're building sustainable operations through sound management." He gestured to the documentation. "Those numbers show a business moving from desperation to stability. The trajectory is clear." Wright was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers again. "I need to consult with our acquisitions committee. This isn't a decision I can make alone." "We understand," Evelyn said, "but we'd appreciate a timely response. We're operating under significant uncertainty, which affects our ability to make business decisions and meet our obligations to partners." "I'll expedite review. Can you return tomorrow afternoon?" "Yes." "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wright." Walking out of the bank, Caleb felt like he'd just survived a battle. "How do you think that went?" "Better than it could have. Worse than I'd hoped." Evelyn's face was unreadable. "He's considering it seriously, which is something, but he's also a banker, which means he's calculating risk versus return. We need to be prepared for either answer. They stayed that night in a modest boarding house, neither sleeping well. Caleb lay awake thinking about everything that hung in balance: the ranch, their future, the community they'd helped build. If First National called the loan, it wasn't just them who'd be affected. The cooperative families, the railroad contracts, the entire network of relationships they'd created would be disrupted. The next afternoon, they returned to Wright's office. He had a different expression this time, not quite friendly, but less skeptical. "I've reviewed your case with our committee," he said once they were seated. "We've decided to maintain your restructured loan terms with one modification." Evelyn's hand tightened on her portfolio. "What modification?" "We want quarterly reviews for the first year. Not full audits, just basic financial reports showing your operation remains stable. If you maintain the positive trajectory shown in your documentation, we'll continue the loan as restructured. If performance deteriorates significantly, we reserve the right to renegotiate terms." It wasn't perfect, but it was survival. Evelyn nodded immediately. "That's acceptable. We already maintain quarterly reports for our own purposes. Providing copies to the bank won't be burdensome." "Then we have an agreement." Wright pulled out papers already prepared. "These are the modified terms. Review them, and if they're acceptable, we can finalize today." Evelyn read every word twice, Caleb looking over her shoulder. It was all there. The original restructured payment schedule, the modified interest rate, everything they'd fought to establish with Merchant. The only addition was the quarterly review requirement, which was exactly what Wright had described. "This is acceptable," Evelyn said, and signed her name with a hand that trembled only slightly. When they walked out of First National Bank this time, they had a signed agreement that secured their future. Not forever, not with complete certainty, but with enough stability to keep building. On the train back to Nebraska, Evelyn finally allowed herself to relax slightly, leaning against Caleb's shoulder as the prairie rolled past the windows. "We did it," she said quietly. "Again. How many times can we keep pulling victory out of disaster?" "As many times as we have to." But her voice carried exhaustion alongside determination. "Though I'll admit, I'm getting tired of living on the edge of catastrophe." "Maybe we're past that now. The loan is secure, the operation is profitable, the community network is strong. Maybe we've finally reached stability." "Maybe." She didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe we've just reached a different level of challenges. Success brings its own complications." She was right, as the following months would prove. With the loan crisis resolved, they could finally focus on growth rather than survival. The ranch operations expanded, the cooperative strengthened, and their reputation continued to grow. Regional newspapers ran follow-up stories about their ongoing success. The territorial government asked Evelyn to consult on agricultural development policies. Opportunities multiplied faster than they could evaluate them. But success also meant scrutiny. In June, they received notice that the territorial tax assessor was reviewing their property valuation due to reported improvements and increased productivity. It was standard procedure, but the timing felt suspicious. Someone had flagged their property specifically. "Blackwell," Caleb said when they received the notice. "He's still out there, still looking for ways to hurt us." "Of course he is. We humiliated him publicly, multiple times. Men like that don't forgive." Evelyn was already reviewing their tax records. "But this could actually work in our favor if we're smart about it." "How is higher property taxes working in our favor?" "Because it establishes documented property value. If our assessment increases based on legitimate improvements, that becomes official record of our ranch's worth. That protects us if we ever need to leverage the property for capital or defend against any future acquisition attempts." She was thinking strategically again, turning potential threat into advantage. "We document every improvement we've made, show the assessor exactly what we've built, and let them establish a high valuation. Yes, we'll pay more taxes, but we'll also have official recognition of value that serves as legal protection." The assessment process took 3 weeks, with the territorial assessor examining every aspect of their operation. He seemed impressed despite his bureaucratic demeanor, noting improvements to structures, irrigation developments, the apple operation, the diversified revenue streams. When the new assessment came through, their property valuation had increased by 40%. The tax bill increased proportionally. But as Evelyn had predicted, the documented value provided legal protections that were worth more than the additional cost. You really do turn everything into strategic advantage, Caleb observed, reviewing the assessment documents. It's either that or let circumstances control us. I prefer to control circumstances. She filed the papers carefully. Though I'll admit, I'm starting to wonder if we'll ever reach a point where we're not constantly maneuvering. It was becoming a recurring theme, this sense that they were successful but never secure, always having to stay 3 steps ahead just to maintain what they'd built. The constant strategic warfare was exhausting, even when they were winning. In August, Tom Brennan approached them with an unexpected proposal. His homestead was finally proven up, officially his, and he wanted to formalize their partnership arrangement into something more permanent. "You've helped me build a successful operation," Tom said, sitting at their kitchen table with his hat in his hands. "The materials you provided, the advice Evelyn gave, the cooperative connections, I wouldn't have survived without them. I'd like to formalize a permanent mutual support agreement between our properties. Official partnership on certain ventures, shared resources, combined advocacy on policy issues." Evelyn considered this carefully. "What you're describing is essentially a multi-property operation, a small ranching alliance." "I guess so, yeah. There's 3 other homesteaders who'd be interested too. The Hendersons, the Carters, and the Yates family. All people you've helped through the cooperative who want closer connection." Tom looked between them. "We'd all maintain independent ownership, but we'd coordinate on major decisions, share equipment and resources more formally, present a united front on issues like water rights and territorial policy." "It's an interesting idea," Caleb said, looking at Evelyn. "What do you think?" "I think it's brilliant. Exactly the kind of alliance that creates real stability." Her mind was already racing through possibilities. 5 independent properties coordinating strategy and resources. That's significant enough to have real political weight. Too large for anyone to casually threaten or manipulate. Over the next month, they formalized what became known as the Prairie Alliance. 5 homesteads bound by agreement to coordinate on specific issues while maintaining individual autonomy. It wasn't a formal corporation or legal entity, just a documented understanding backed by genuine relationships and mutual interest. But the effect was immediate. When the Prairie Alliance spoke on issues affecting small ranchers, people listened. They had collective political weight that individual homesteaders lacked. They could negotiate better terms with suppliers, present unified positions to territorial officials, and defend each other against the kind of predatory practices that had nearly destroyed Caleb's ranch. Aaron Blackwell noticed. Everyone noticed. The power dynamics in the county were shifting, and the established interests that had controlled frontier economics for years suddenly faced organized opposition. The confrontation came in September, at a county meeting about proposed changes to water management regulations. Blackwell and his allies pushed for rules that would have given priority access to established large ranchers, essentially grandfathering in advantages that would shut out smaller operations. The Prairie Alliance presented a counter-proposal developed primarily by Evelyn, a framework that balanced established use with emerging needs, protected small holders while recognizing large operations' existing investments, and created clear processes for dispute resolution. The debate was fierce, but the alliance had done their preparation. They had data, legal precedents, and compelling arguments about economic development and territorial growth. More importantly, they represented a voting bloc that county officials couldn't ignore. When the vote happened, the alliance proposal passed by a narrow margin. It was a watershed moment. Small ranchers had directly defeated the established power structure on a major policy issue. Walking out of that meeting, Evelyn looked stunned despite having led the effort. "We actually won. Against Blackwell, against the old guard, against everything." "You won," Caleb corrected. "That proposal was your work." "We won. All of us together. That's what made it possible." She stopped on the street, looking back at the meeting hall. "This is what I wanted to build. Not just a successful ranch, but a system where success is possible for people willing to work for it. Where strategy and cooperation matter more than who was here first or who has the most power. You're changing the frontier. We're changing it. The alliance, the cooperative, all the families who took the risk to try something different." She smiled, and it was genuine, unguarded in a way Caleb rarely saw. Maybe this is what stability looks like. Not absence of conflict, but confidence that we can handle the conflicts that come. That confidence was tested again in October when Silas Merchant, freshly unemployed after his bank's collapse and facing potential fraud charges, made one final desperate attempt at revenge. He filed complaints with the territorial government, alleging that the Prairie Alliance was an illegal trust designed to restrain trade and manipulate markets. It was purely vindictive, the claims had no merit, but it triggered an investigation that consumed weeks of time and required extensive documentation. Evelyn had to travel back to the territorial capital, present testimony, provide evidence of the alliance's actual structure and operations. The investigation concluded that the alliance was completely legal, just a voluntary association of independent operators. But it cost them time, money, and energy at a point when they were already stretched thin. "This is what defeat looks like for men like Merchant," Evelyn said when it was finally over. "They can't win, so they try to make everyone else lose too, drag everyone down into failure with them. At least it's over. This particular battle is over, but there will be others." She looked at him, and he saw something in her expression. Not defeat exactly, but a kind of weary acceptance. "This is our life now, Caleb. Success that requires constant defense. Stability that demands relentless vigilance. Is this what you want? Is this enough?" It was the most vulnerable he'd ever heard her sound, and he understood she was asking something deeper than just about the ranch. She was asking if he truly accepted the life they'd built together, complicated, demanding, full of conflict, but also full of purpose. "It's more than enough," he said honestly. 2 years ago, I was failing alone, watching everything crumble. Now I'm succeeding with a partner who makes me better, building something that matters to a whole community. The fight is hard, but what we're fighting for is worth it." She nodded slowly, and he saw her draw strength from his certainty. "All right then, we keep fighting." And they did. The winter that followed brought a change neither of them had anticipated. Not another crisis, not another battle, but something quieter and more profound. The slow realization that they'd actually won. It started with small things. In November, the First National Bank sent their quarterly review back with a note from Harrison Wright complimenting their consistent performance and waiving the remaining quarterly reviews as unnecessary. In December, the Prairie Alliance held its first annual meeting and voted unanimously to continue operations with expanded membership. 8 families now, representing over 2,000 acres of coordinated ranching operations. But the real turning point came in January when Aaron Blackwell did something no one expected. He requested a meeting with Caleb and Evelyn. They met at Judge Cooper's office, neutral territory, with Cooper present as mediator. Blackwell arrived looking older than Caleb remembered, the fight seeming to have aged him in ways the years hadn't. "I'm not here to apologize," Blackwell said once they were seated. "Don't expect that from me." "We don't," Evelyn replied calmly. "What are you here for, Mr. Blackwell?" "To propose a truce, maybe even cooperation." He pulled out a document. "I'm expanding operations into cattle breeding rather than just range cattle. Quality bloodlines, improved stock. It requires different approach, more like farming than traditional ranching. Your diversification model, your systematic approach. I've been watching it work." Caleb exchanged a glance with Evelyn, seeing his own surprise reflected in her expression. "You want to copy our methods?" Evelyn asked. "I want to learn from them, and I'm willing to pay for that knowledge." Blackwell set the document on the table. "This is a proposal for a consulting arrangement. You advise me on operational improvements and strategic planning. I pay a monthly fee and give you breeding rights access to my improved stock lines." It was so unexpected that Caleb didn't know how to respond. This was the man who'd tried to steal their land, who'd poisoned cattle, who'd made their lives hell for 2 years, and now he wanted to pay them for advice. Evelyn studied the proposal with her usual careful attention. Why now? Why this change? Blackwell was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm 62 years old, and I'm watching the frontier change, whether I like it or not. Your alliance, your cooperative, your new approaches, they're not going away. If anything, they're spreading. I can either keep fighting change until it destroys me, or I can adapt." He met Evelyn's eyes directly. "You were right about strategic thinking mattering more than tradition. Took me too long to see it, but I'm not too proud to admit when I'm wrong." "That sounds very close to an apology," Evelyn observed. "It's an acknowledgement. Best you'll get from me." She looked at Caleb, a silent question. He could see her calculating. The advantages of having Blackwell as an ally instead of an enemy, the income from consulting fees, the access to breeding stock that would improve their own herd, but also the risk of trusting someone who'd tried to destroy them. "We'll need to discuss this privately," Evelyn said. "Can we respond tomorrow?" "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." Blackwell stood, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Boone, you've got steel in you. Reminded me why I loved this frontier in the first place, when it rewarded people who were smart and tough enough to survive it. You're both those things." After he left, Judge Cooper let out a low whistle. "Never thought I'd see Aaron Blackwell ask anyone for help. You two have really changed things around here." That night, Caleb and Evelyn sat at their kitchen table, reviewing Blackwell's proposal and debating its merits. The discussion went in circles for hours, weighing risks against opportunities, past wrongs against future possibilities. "The money would be useful," Caleb said. $100 a month for consulting is significant." "Money's always useful, but is it worth working with someone who tried to destroy us?" Evelyn tapped her pencil against the paper. "I keep thinking this is some kind of trap. What if it's not? What if he's genuine about adapting? Then we'd be fools not to take advantage of it. An alliance with Blackwell would make the Prairie Alliance nearly untouchable politically and economically." She set down her pencil. "But I need to know you're comfortable with this. He hurt you directly. The poisoned cattle, the land claim, all of it. I won't force you to work with him if you can't." Caleb thought about that, about the anger he'd carried for so long, the sense of being threatened and undermined. But he also thought about pragmatism, about the difference between holding grudges and moving forward. "I don't like him," he said finally. "Probably never will. But I can work with him if it's in our interest. And teaching him our methods? That doesn't diminish us. If anything, it proves we were right all along." "That's what I think too." Evelyn smiled slightly. "Look at us. 2 years ago, we were desperate people trying to survive. Now we're considering whether to consult for the man who wanted us destroyed. That's not just survival, that's victory." They accepted Blackwell's proposal the next day, with modifications that Evelyn negotiated to protect their interests and ensure clear boundaries. The consulting arrangement began in February, and to everyone's surprise, it worked. Blackwell proved to be a demanding but fair client, genuinely interested in learning rather than just exploiting their knowledge. The shift in their relationship with Blackwell had ripple effects throughout the county. If the biggest rancher and the innovative newcomers could work together, old hostilities seemed pointless. Other established ranchers began approaching the Prairie Alliance with questions and proposals. The rigid divide between old guard and new approaches began to blur. By spring, the transformation was undeniable. The ranch that had been dying 3 years ago was now profitable enough that Caleb and Evelyn were discussing expansion possibilities. The Prairie Alliance had grown to 12 member families and was being studied by territorial officials as a model for rural development. Evelyn had been invited to speak at agricultural conferences in 3 different states about frontier economics and cooperative strategies. "We're becoming respectable," Caleb observed one evening as they reviewed yet another speaking invitation. "Maybe even influential." Terrifying thought, but Evelyn smiled as she said it. "Though I suppose influence is useful if we want to keep pushing for reforms that help people like us. People like us don't exist anymore. We're not struggling homesteaders fighting for survival. We're successful ranchers with political connections and regional recognition. We're people who remember what struggling felt like. That matters." She set aside the invitation and looked at him directly. "Promise me something, Caleb. Promise that no matter how successful we become, we don't forget what brought us here. We don't become the kind of people we fought against." "I promise, though I think you'd shoot me yourself if I tried to turn into another merchant or pre-reform Blackwell." "I absolutely would." She laughed, and the sound was lighter than he'd heard in months, though hopefully it won't come to that. The ranch operations continued expanding through summer. They bought additional land from a retiring homesteader, expanding their property to 500 acres. The apple operation tripled in size with the planting of 60 new trees. The cattle herd grew to 90 head of improved stock, thanks to breeding rights from Blackwell's operation. Every metric showed growth, not reckless expansion, but sustainable development built on sound strategy. But the real success was measured in something harder to quantify: The cooperative had grown to encompass 30 families across 2 counties. The Prairie Alliance model was being replicated in other regions. The territorial government had implemented several policy reforms that Evelyn had advocated for. The frontier was changing, becoming more organized and less brutal, and they'd been part of making that happen. In August, they received an unexpected visit from Harrison Wright of First National Bank. He arrived unannounced, which immediately put them on alert. Bankers didn't make surprise visits unless there was trouble. But Wright was smiling when they met him at the door. "Apologies for not wiring ahead. I was traveling through the territory on other business and wanted to stop personally." "Is there a problem with our loan?" Evelyn asked, already mentally preparing for whatever crisis this represented. "Quite the opposite. Your loan has performed so well that our board wanted me to discuss expansion opportunities with you." He pulled out papers. "First National is interested in providing additional capital for operational expansion at favorable terms, using your proven track record as justification." Caleb blinked. "You want to lend us more money?" "We want to invest in a demonstrated success. Your operation has been profitable for 8 consecutive quarters. Your community initiatives have created stability that benefits multiple borrowers. You're exactly the kind of operation banks want to support." Wright spread the papers on their kitchen table. "We're proposing a development loan of $2,000 at 6% interest, no penalties, to be used for infrastructure improvements and operational expansion as you see fit." It was almost exactly the opposite of their situation 3 years ago. Instead of facing foreclosure, they were being courted for expansion capital. The reversal was so complete that Evelyn actually laughed. "What's funny?" Wright asked, looking confused. "I'm sorry, it's just 3 years ago, your institution acquired a loan where we were 3 weeks from foreclosure. Now you're offering us expansion capital." She shook her head. "The contrast is striking. That's the difference between distressed debt and performing debt. You transformed the first into the second through exceptional management." Wright smiled. "This is how banking is supposed to work. Capital flowing to successful operations that can deploy it effectively. You're the model borrowers every bank hopes to find." They reviewed the proposal carefully, and it was genuinely good. Reasonable terms, flexible deployment, none of the predatory provisions that had characterized merchants' lending. After Wright left with their tentative acceptance pending full review, Caleb and Evelyn sat in silence for a long moment. "We won," Caleb said quietly. "Not just survived, not just got by. We actually won. We built something worth winning." Oh, Evelyn was staring at the loan proposal like it might disappear. "Something sustainable and valuable, something that matters. Because of you. Because you saw possibilities I couldn't see and had the courage to fight for them. Because of us." She looked at him with an intensity that made him catch his breath. "I provided strategy, but you provided trust. You believed in my plans when you had every reason not to. You supported me when the entire community thought I was crazy. You stood beside me through every battle." Her voice caught slightly. "I couldn't have done any of this alone, Caleb. We did it together." He pulled her close, and they held each other in the kitchen that had been the war room for so many strategic battles. "So what do we do now? We've achieved everything we were fighting for. What comes next?" "We keep building. We help other people achieve what we achieved. We push for reforms that make the frontier less brutal and more fair." She pulled back to look at him. "And maybe we start thinking about building a family, not just a ranch." It was the first time either of them had mentioned children, though the possibility had been hovering unspoken for months. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a new kind of hope. "I'd like that," he said. "Kids growing up here, learning to think strategically while they're learning to rope cattle. Carrying forward what we've built. Teaching them that success comes from using your mind as much as your muscles. That cooperation matters more than domination. That the frontier can be civilized without losing what makes it vital." She smiled. "That's a legacy worth building." Through the fall, they implemented the expansion plans that the First National loan made possible. A new barn that doubled their storage capacity. An irrigation system that secured water for the apple operation regardless of drought. Improved fencing and water systems across the entire property. Each improvement made operations more efficient and more profitable, but they also devoted time and resources to helping others. Evelyn held workshops teaching bookkeeping and strategic planning to homesteader wives who wanted to understand their family finances better. Caleb shared his hard-won knowledge about cattle management and land use with young ranchers just starting out. The Prairie Alliance established a loan fund to help new members with startup costs, using the model of mutual support that had saved Caleb's ranch. In November, territorial officials announced a major policy initiative based largely on recommendations from the Prairie Alliance, a comprehensive rural development program that would provide technical assistance, coordinated marketing support, and infrastructure investment to small ranchers and farmers across Nebraska territory. It was everything Evelyn had been advocating for, codified into official policy. The announcement event was held in Omaha, and Evelyn was invited as one of the keynote speakers. Caleb sat in the audience, watching his wife address a room full of territorial officials and business leaders with the same confident competence she'd brought to saving their ranch. She outlined the principles that had guided their success and argued for their systematic application across the territory. "The frontier doesn't have to be a place where people struggle alone against impossible odds," she said from the podium. "It can be a place where strategic thinking and mutual support create sustainable prosperity, where innovation is rewarded and cooperation is valued, where success is determined by intelligence and determination rather than who was here first or who has the most power." Her voice carried clear conviction. "That's the frontier I want to build. That's the future we can create together if we're brave enough to try." The audience applauded, and Caleb felt pride surge through him. This woman had arrived on a train platform 3 years ago with nothing but a leather ledger and desperate courage. Now she was shaping territorial policy and inspiring a new generation of frontier settlers. The transformation was remarkable. But what struck him most wasn't her public success. It was the way she caught his eye across the crowded room and smiled. A private smile that acknowledged he was the reason she could stand up there with confidence, because she knew someone believed in her completely. After the speech, they were approached by reporters, officials, and various people wanting to discuss opportunities and partnerships. Evelyn handled it all with practiced grace, but Caleb could see the exhaustion building. When they finally escaped back to their hotel room late that evening, she collapsed into a chair with visible relief. "I'm tired of being inspiring," she said. "I just want to go home and work on the books and argue with Tom about fence repairs. We're leaving tomorrow, back to normal life." "Normal life?" She laughed. "Remember when normal meant being 3 weeks from foreclosure? When normal was fighting for survival every single day? That wasn't normal. That was desperate." Caleb sat beside her. "This is normal. Sustainable operations, manageable challenges, building for the future rather than just trying to survive the present. I like this normal better." "Me too." They returned to the ranch the next day, and the familiar sight of their land spreading out toward the horizon brought a sense of peace that no amount of regional recognition could match. This was home, not just a property they owned, but a place they'd built through shared struggle and determination. Winter settled in with unusual gentleness that year, and they spent the cold months planning for the spring and enjoying something they'd rarely experienced before: actual peace. No crisis demanded immediate attention. No enemy plotted their destruction. The loan payments were comfortable, the operations were running smoothly, and their future looked genuinely secure. On a cold January evening, sitting by the fire with ledgers spread across the table, more from habit than necessity, Evelyn said, "Do you remember what you told me that first day? On the train platform? I told you I was drowning in debt and you should leave. You told me the truth. You could have hidden it, trapped me into staying through deception. Instead, you gave me choice." She set down her pen. "That honesty was the foundation of everything we built. Partnership based on truth rather than manipulation. I didn't know how to be anything else. Too tired for deception by that point. It was more than exhaustion. It was integrity. You'd rather lose alone with honor than win through deceit." She moved to sit beside him. "That's why I stayed. Not because I thought we'd succeed, but because I respected you enough to want to try. And now? Now I love you, completely, for your integrity and your strength and your willingness to let me be who I needed to be." She took his hand. "I know we married for practical reasons, but somewhere along the way it became real, more real than I ever expected." Caleb pulled her close, feeling the truth of her words resonate in his own chest. "I love you too. for your brilliance and your courage and your refusal to accept defeat. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. We saved each other. That's what partnership means. They sat together in the firelight, and Caleb thought about the journey they'd traveled. From desperate strangers to strategic partners to something deeper than either had anticipated. They'd built a ranch, built a community, built a model for how the frontier could work. But more importantly, they'd built a relationship based on mutual respect, shared challenges, and genuine love. In March, Evelyn confirmed what they'd both suspected. She was pregnant. The news brought a different kind of joy than their business successes, something more personal and profound. They would have a child who'd grow up on this land they'd fought so hard to keep, who'd benefit from the systems and reforms they'd created, who'd carry forward the legacy of strategic thinking and determined action. Boy or girl, they're going to be formidable, Caleb said, his hand on Evelyn's still flat stomach. With our combined stubbornness? Absolutely terrifying, but she was smiling. Though hopefully they'll have an easier path than we did. That's the point of all this work, making the frontier less brutal for the next generation. Spring arrived with renewed hope and expanding possibilities. The ranch operations were so well established now that they practically ran themselves, requiring oversight rather than constant crisis management. The Prairie Alliance continued growing, now encompassing 18 families across 3 counties. The cooperative had become a permanent institution, recognized by territorial officials as a model program. But perhaps the most satisfying development came in April, when Aaron Blackwell made another unexpected visit. He arrived at the ranch with a proposition that demonstrated just how much the frontier had changed. "I'm getting old," he said bluntly, sitting at their kitchen table. "My sons have no interest in ranching. They've gone east for university and aren't coming back. I need to start thinking about succession for the Triple Bar." "What are you proposing?" Evelyn asked, though Caleb could see her mind already racing through possibilities. "A gradual transition. Over the next 5 years, I teach you everything I know about large-scale ranching operations. You teach me more of your strategic approaches. When I'm ready to retire, you acquire the Triple Bar under terms that allow me to live out my years comfortably while you take over operations." He spread his hands. "You're the only people I trust to run it the way it should be run. Profitably, but not predatorily. Efficiently, but not brutally." It was a staggering offer. The Triple Bar was the largest ranch in the county. 5,000 acres, state-of-the-art facilities, established markets. Combined with their own operation, it would create an agricultural enterprise of significant scale. "That's extremely generous," Evelyn said carefully, "but also extremely complicated. We'd need to review the financials, understand the full scope of operations, and determine if we could manage that scale of operations." "Of course. I'm not asking for immediate answer. I'm asking you to consider it." Blackwell stood. "Take your time, but know that I'm serious. You two represent the future of frontier ranching, strategic, innovative, community-focused. I'd rather see the Triple Bar continue under your management than watch it get carved up and sold to speculators after I'm gone." After he left, Caleb and Evelyn sat in stunned silence. "Did that just happen?" Caleb finally asked. "I think Aaron Blackwell just offered us his empire." Evelyn was staring at nothing, clearly processing the implications. "Everything we've built times 10, the scale of impact we could have, the model we could create. Also the scale of responsibility and risk. Always risk, but we've gotten pretty good at managing risk." She looked at him. "Do you want this? Do you want to build something even bigger?" Caleb thought about that question carefully. 3 years ago, he would have said no immediately. The scale was too large, the complications too many. But 3 years had taught him to think differently, to see possibilities instead of just obstacles. "I want to build whatever lets us have the most positive impact," he said finally. "If that means managing a 5,000-acre operation, then yes. If it means focusing on our current ranch and helping others through the alliance, that's good too. Either way, I want to keep doing what we've been doing, proving that there's a better way to make the frontier work. Then we'll evaluate the opportunity properly and make the decision together." She smiled, "like we do everything else." Through the summer, they conducted a thorough analysis of the Triple Bar opportunity while maintaining their own operations and managing Evelyn's advancing pregnancy. It was exhausting, but exhilarating, opening up possibilities neither had imagined even a year before. The baby arrived in September, a daughter they named Catherine after Evelyn's mother. She was healthy and loud and utterly fearless from the moment she drew breath, and Caleb fell in love immediately. Watching Evelyn with their daughter, seeing her fierce protectiveness and gentle teaching combined, Caleb understood something profound. The legacy they were building wasn't just about land or business success. It was about demonstrating that intelligence and determination could create sustainable prosperity, that cooperation mattered more than domination, that the frontier could be civilized without losing what made it vital. Their daughter would grow up in a world they'd helped shape, one where small ranchers had political voice, where predatory lending was regulated, where community support systems existed to help people survive hard times. A frontier that was still challenging, but no longer quite so brutal. In October, after months of careful evaluation, they accepted Blackwell's succession proposal with modifications that protected both parties' interests. The transition would take 5 years, giving them time to learn large-scale operations while maintaining their own ranch and alliance commitments. It was ambitious, perhaps even audacious, but they'd learned to be comfortable with ambitious plans. On a crisp November evening, as the first snow of winter drifted down outside, Caleb and Evelyn sat together on their porch, with Catherine sleeping between them. The ranch stretched out before them, land they'd saved through strategy and determination, land that had become profitable through innovation and hard work, land that would continue supporting their family and their community for generations. "Remember when you stepped off that train?" Caleb said quietly. "When I told you everything was falling apart and you asked to see the books? I remember thinking you were either remarkably honest or remarkably foolish." Evelyn smiled. "Turned out you were both. And I remember thinking you were either remarkably brave or remarkably naive." "Also both." She leaned against his shoulder. "But we made it work. Against impossible odds, through constant challenges, we built something that matters. Not just survived. Thrived." "Thrived," she agreed, though it's still strange to say it. For so long, survival was the only goal. Now we're building legacies and shaping policy and planning 5 years ahead. The change is dizzying. Good dizzying or bad dizzying? Good. Definitely good. She was quiet for a moment, watching the snowfall. "I used to think success meant security, having enough money, enough stability to never worry again. But that's not what this is. Success is having agency, having the power to shape circumstances instead of just reacting to them. Building systems that help other people achieve the same agency. That's a more complicated definition than most people use. Most people haven't fought for it the way we did." She gestured to the ranch, to the land they'd saved. "Every acre of this represents a battle won through strategic thinking. Every improvement represents investment we made possible through careful planning. Every family in the alliance represents someone we helped find their own path to stability. That's success. Not what we accumulated, but what we enabled." Caleb thought about that, about the families who'd joined the cooperative, the ranchers who'd learned from their methods, the policies that had been reformed based on their advocacy, the ripples spreading out from their initial desperate struggle. "We changed things," he said, "actually changed how the frontier works. We demonstrated an alternative. People always had choices. They just didn't realize it, because the brutal way was the only way they'd seen." She looked at him directly. "That's what you gave me that first day. You showed me the brutal reality, and I showed you there were other approaches. Together we proved those approaches could work. Best partnership I ever made. Only partnership that mattered." She smiled. "Though if you told me on that train platform that 3 years later I'd be sitting here planning to acquire the largest ranch in the county while raising a daughter who'll probably grow up to be either a banker or a revolutionary, I would have thought you were insane. Are those different things? You're kind of both." "Fair point." She laughed, and the sound carried warmth that had nothing to do with the fire inside. "Maybe Catherine will be both too. A revolutionary banker who reforms financial systems through strategic thinking and relentless determination." "With our genetics?" "Absolutely." Caleb looked down at their sleeping daughter. "She's going to change the world. She's going to have the opportunity to change the world, because we fought to create that opportunity." Evelyn's voice was fierce with conviction. "That's the whole point. We didn't just save a ranch. We created possibility for ourselves, for our community, for our daughter. We proved that intelligence and determination could overcome structural disadvantages. That's a legacy worth building. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, watching the snow transform their land into something beautiful and peaceful. The battles weren't over. There would always be challenges, always be people who resisted change, always be circumstances that required strategic thinking and hard work to overcome. But they'd proven they could handle those challenges. Together, they were formidable. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, and Evelyn shifted Catherine slightly, protective instinct automatic. But the baby didn't wake. Secure in the knowledge that she was safe, that her parents were there, that the world they'd built around her was solid. "We should go inside," Caleb said finally. "Getting cold." "A few more minutes. I want to remember this moment, when everything finally felt secure, when we could look at what we'd built and know it was real and lasting." She leaned her head against his shoulder. 3 years ago, I stepped off a train into uncertainty. Now I'm sitting on a porch of a profitable ranch, holding my daughter, planning a future that extends beyond mere survival. That transformation still feels miraculous. It wasn't miraculous. It was strategic thinking combined with relentless work. Maybe that's what miracles are. Not supernatural intervention, but human determination refusing to accept defeat. She stood carefully, cradling Catherine. "Come on, let's go inside. We have quarterly reports to review and succession plans to study, and 1,000 other things that prove we're not just surviving anymore." They went inside, into the house that had been falling apart when Evelyn first arrived, but was now solid and warm and home. The kitchen table was still covered with papers, financial projections, alliance correspondence, planning documents for the triple bar transition, evidence of ongoing work, of futures being built, of success that required constant attention. But it was good work, meaningful work. Work that mattered not just to them, but to dozens of families across multiple counties who'd learned that there was another way to survive on the frontier. That strategic thinking mattered as much as physical strength. That cooperation could be more powerful than competition. That the brutal way wasn't the only way. As Evelyn settled Catherine into her cradle and returned to the papers spread across the table, Caleb felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the woman who'd seen potential where he'd seen only failure. For the partnership they'd built through shared struggle. For the daughter who represented hope and continuity. For the community they'd helped create. For the future that stretched out before them, full of possibility because they'd refused to accept the limitations others had tried to impose. They'd arrived at the edge of survival and transformed it into something more. Not through luck or miracles, but through intelligence and determination and the courage to think differently. They'd proven that even in the harshest place, success belonged to those bold enough to challenge the way things had always been done. And in proving it, they'd changed everything. Evelyn looked up from her papers, caught his eye, and smiled. That smile held everything: love and partnership and shared triumph and the quiet confidence of people who'd fought impossible battles and won. "Thank you," Caleb said, "for not getting back on that train. Thank you for being honest enough to give me a choice." She returned to her work, pen moving across paper with practiced efficiency. "Now stop being sentimental and help me review these projections. The triple bar transition requires detailed financial planning, and I need your input on the cattle operation projections." He laughed and joined her at the table, pulling papers toward him. This was their life now, partnership in everything. From raising a daughter to managing multi-ranch operations to planning reforms that would affect the entire territory. It was complicated and demanding, and sometimes exhausting, but it was theirs. Built by their hands, guided by their minds, sustained by their determination. A legacy of strategic thinking and mutual support that would outlast them both, shaping the frontier for generations to come. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the harsh land in gentle white. But inside there was warmth and purpose, and the satisfaction of work that mattered. The ranch that had been dying 3 years ago was now the foundation of an expanding enterprise. The woman who'd arrived as a desperate mail-order bride was now shaping territorial policy. The man who'd been drowning in debt was now teaching the next generation of ranchers how to succeed. They'd won. Not just survived, not just persevered, but actually won. They'd turned certain death into an empire, proving that in the harshest places, survival truly did belong to those bold enough to think differently. And in the quiet of that winter evening, working side by side on plans for a future they'd created together, Caleb and Evelyn understood something profound. The greatest victory wasn't the ranch they'd saved, or the wealth they'd accumulated, or even the reforms they'd inspired. The greatest victory was the partnership they'd forged. Two desperate people who'd found each other at the edge of disaster and built something that changed the world. That was the real legacy. That was what would endure. That was enough.